Over 300 million years ago, all the land on our planet was gathered into a single giant supercontinent called Pangea, a time when Earth itself seemed hostile to life, with burning deserts stretching for thousands of miles, poisonous gases drifting through the air, and oceans that had turned into toxic traps. This was the age of Pangea at its deadliest, one supercontinent where strange creatures struggled to endure and entire species vanished forever. Above it stretched a sky filled with stars and constellations unfamiliar to modern eyes, a night view that no human has ever seen. But Pangea was not just a dry slab of rock, it was alive. Vast deserts rolled out like seas of sand, while thick, steamy rainforests thrived with strange plants and creatures. It was a land of extremes, where every corner told a different story. Before we start, let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there now, and settle in for a journey to the deadliest time of Pangea. More than 300 million years ago, the Earth looked completely different from the world we know today. All of its continents, which are now scattered across the globe, were once joined together in a single colossal landmass known as Pangea. This supercontinent was not created overnight, but through an unimaginably slow process that stretched across hundreds of millions of years. Scientists call this process continental drift, a phenomenon first proposed in the early 20th century by a German scientist named Alfred Wegener. His bold idea suggested that the Earth's land masses had once been united, only to be pushed apart by the restless movement of the planet's crust. The Earth's crust is not one solid piece. Instead, it is broken into giant slabs called tectonic plates, which float on top of the semi-fluid layer of hot rock beneath, known as the mantle. Over vast stretches of time, these plates slide, collide, and separate, all thanks to the slow circulation of heat deep within the Earth, what scientists call convection currents. These hidden movements are the engine behind mountain building, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and, ultimately, the shifting of entire continents. During the late Paleozoic era, roughly 300 million years ago, the wandering continents began to collide with one another. This was not a gentle merging, but a world-shaking event marked by the rise of enormous mountain chains and the closing of ancient seas. Piece by piece, the continents locked together until they formed the supercontinent Pangea. The final act of this assembly came when two massive landmasses, Gondwana, which included what is now Africa, South America, India, Australia and Antarctica, and Laurasia, which included North America, Europe and Asia, slammed together. At its height, Pangea was truly the centerpiece of the planet. It sat like a giant puzzle piece surrounded by an enormous global ocean called Panthalassa. This ocean stretched almost endlessly, covering most of the Earth's surface, while Pangea itself was ringed by smaller seas. The joining of so much land created new ecosystems where plants and animals could spread more freely, but it also brought with it great geological unrest. Stress built up where the plates pressed against one another, sparking frequent volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that shook the supercontinent. Yet, just as the same forces of plate tectonics created Pangea, they also ensured that it would not last forever. About 200 million years ago, during the Mesozoic era, Pangea began to split apart. Cracks opened in its crust as molten rock pushed upward, tearing the supercontinent into pieces. Over tens of millions of years, those pieces drifted into the positions where we now find the continents today. This dramatic breakup not only reshaped the face of the Earth, but also transformed life itself. New coastlines, climates, and habitats emerged, giving plants and animals new opportunities to adapt, spread, and evolve. The science of plate tectonics helps explain in detail how Pangea came together and later broke apart. Tectonic plates interact in different ways. At convergent boundaries, where plates push against each other, the crust crumples and folds, giving rise to mountain ranges such as the modern Andes. At divergent boundaries, where plates pull apart, molten rock rises to fill the gap, creating new crust along features like the mid-ocean ridges. Another important process is subduction, where one plate sinks beneath another. Subduction zones not only feed volcanoes but also close off seas and lift new mountain ranges, further shaping the land. Pangea's existence is more than just an idea. It is supported by powerful evidence from many different sciences. Geology reveals that mountain ranges and rock layers on opposite sides of oceans often match up perfectly, as though they were once joined. For instance, the Appalachian Mountains of North America line up strikingly with the Caledonian Mountains of Scotland, suggesting they were once part of the same chain before the Atlantic Ocean split them apart. Fossil records also tell the story. The freshwater reptile Mesosaurus, for example, left its remains in both South America and Africa. It would have been impossible for this small creature to swim across an ocean, meaning the two continents must once have been connected. Even paleoclimate evidence strengthens the case. Coal beds, which only form in warm, swampy environments, are found in regions like North America and Europe that today lie in much cooler climates. This means those areas must once have been much closer to the equator. On the other hand, traces of ancient glaciers are found in tropical regions such as India and Africa, showing that those lands once sat near the poles. All of this points toward a time when the continents were gathered together in a very different arrangement than today. The breakup of Pangea was not the end of the story, but just another chapter in Earth's restless cycle of creation and destruction. The continents are still drifting today, slowly but surely. Mountains rise, oceans widen, and islands form, all under the influence of the same forces that once built Pangea. Even now, the Earth is busy crafting its future landscapes. To understand how tectonic plate movements led to the making of the giant landmass Pangea, we first need to understand the nature of the Earth's outer shell. The Earth's hard outer layer, which is made of the crust and the top part of the mantle, is split into big pieces known as tectonic plates. These plates float and move on the soft, partly melted layer beneath them, acting very much like rafts on a huge ocean. Around 300 million years ago, during the late Paleozoic era, these tectonic plates were not in the places we see them today. Instead, they were slowly moving toward each other. This movement was driven by a process called mantle convection. Hot material from deep inside the Earth rises to the surface, cools down, and then sinks back, making a circular motion. This movement pushes and pulls on the tectonic plates, causing them to crash together, pull apart, or slide against one another. As these plates interacted, they started to come together, pushing pieces of land closer. Over millions of years, different parts of land that had once been separated by oceans and other barriers slowly touched and joined. The crashing of plates not only stitched the land together, but also caused great changes on the Earth's surface. Mountain chains, like the Appalachian Mountains and the Himalayas, were formed through these powerful plate crashes, shaping the Earth's surface even more. By the time Pangea was fully formed, it held almost all of the Earth's land in one huge stretch. This joining created a special environment, with many kinds of climates. As Pangea later began to split apart, around 200 million years ago, it started to form the continents we know today. The results of these plate movements hardened the face of our planet and reshaped both the natural world and the land itself, showing how powerful and ever-changing Earth's processes are over time. The making of Pangea, the ancient giant landmass that once joined much of Earth's lands, covers a very long timeline. Scientists suggest that Pangea began to form during the late Paleozoic era, about 300 million years ago. This time marked the last stage of bringing many lands together through tectonic plate movements, creating one great land area surrounded by a single ocean called Panthalassa. Most of Pangea stayed together during much of the late Paleozoic and into the early Mesozoic era. About 200 million years ago, during the Triassic period, it reached its greatest size. Scientists believe that the shape of Pangea had powerful effects on Earth's weather, ocean flows, and the spread of plants and animals. The wide centre of the landmass likely faced extreme weather, forcing living things to make big changes to survive. However, Pangea did not last forever. Around 180 million years ago, during the Jurassic period, it began to break apart. This breaking was caused by the movements of tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface. The once great landmass slowly drifted into the separate continents we know today, such as Africa, South America, and North America. The story of Pangea is not just an interesting part of Earth's history, it also gives us important clues about how continents move and how plates work. Modern science still studies the events that shaped our planet, showing how ancient changes are still visible in today's land and nature. By studying Pangea, we gain a deeper respect for the powerful processes that continue to shape our world. The forming of Pangea, which happened around 300 million years ago, changed Earth's surface in powerful ways. Before Pangea existed, the continents were spread apart, creating a more broken pattern of land. The joining of these lands into one giant mass not only changed the balance of land and water, but also influenced weather, ocean flows, and the growth of life on Earth. As Pangea formed, the crashing of tectonic plates caused major changes. Huge mountain chains, such as the Appalachians and the Urals, rose from this movement, showing the great strength of these forces. The joining of lands also created large inland seas and changed coastlines, making new natural zones. These new areas provided homes for many kinds of life, giving rise to great diversity and new kinds of plants and animals. But Pangea did not stay together. It began to break apart about 200 million years ago, leading to the making of today's continents. This splitting and drifting changed natural systems and helped shape the land we see now. The pulling apart also let melted rock rise and form new oceans, changing the Earth's shape even more. As tectonic plates shifted, they redrew coastlines and caused volcanoes and earthquakes, adding more changes to Earth's surface. Even today, the results of Pangea can still be seen in Earth's features. The lines of mountain ranges, the spread of earthquakes, and even the way fossils of plants and animals are found on faraway continents show the lasting effects of this ancient landmass. Learning about Pangea and what happened after helps us understand not only Earth's past, but also the forces still shaping it today. The forming of Pangea, the giant landmass that existed during the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, was a huge event in Earth's history, tied to the movement of plates. The main tectonic plates in this process included the North American plate, South American plate, Eurasian plate, African plate, Indian plate, Australian plate, and the Antarctic plate. Each plate played an important part as they slowly moved and crashed together over millions of years. Around 300 million years ago, these plates began to come together in a complicated movement, driven by the strong forces beneath Earth's crust. The North American plate moved southward, while the Eurasian plate also drifted south. At the same time, the African plate, which was closely joined with the South American plate, started to push against these northern plates, forming the great landmass that became Pangea. This great movement changed Earth's shape and weather in important ways. One of the most important forces behind the birth of Pangea was the presence of subduction zones. These were places where one massive slab of the Earth's crust, known as a tectonic plate, was forced beneath another. When this happened, the ground did not stay still. Instead, it crumpled, folded, and buckled, creating entire mountain chains. The mighty Appalachian Mountains in North America and the towering Ural Mountains in Eurasia rose out of such monumental collisions. These subduction zones also brought fire to the surface of the Earth, as molten rock pushed upward, sparking volcanic eruptions that painted the prehistoric skies with ash and reshaped the landscape forever. The grinding and crashing of these enormous plates were like the slow beating of the planet's heart. With every clash, mountains grew taller, valleys deepened, and volcanoes poured out new land. Even today, long after Pangea has split apart, we continue to study these ancient scars and formations which remind us of how restless and powerful the Earth truly is. But the story of Pangea did not end with its creation. Over countless millions of years, the same tectonic forces that stitched the land together eventually pulled it apart. What had once been a single, massive supercontinent began to fracture and drift away in different directions. This slow division gave rise to the continents we now recognize: Africa, North and South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica. The breaking of Pangea did not just redraw the map of Earth, it changed the course of life itself. As continents drifted, species were separated by vast oceans, and new paths of evolution began to unfold. Imagine the Earth more than 300 million years ago. Instead of scattered continents divided by seas and oceans, there was one colossal land mass that stretched from the frozen reaches of the North Pole to the icy expanses of the South Pole. This giant world was Pangea, a place where deserts, swamps, rainforests and mountains existed side by side. Its size and unity shaped not only geography, but also the climate and ecosystems that life depended on. The coastline of Pangea was unlike anything we know today. Instead of the broken edges of land separated by wide oceans, Pangea had long, sweeping shores that wrapped around its enormous body. Where today we see smaller bays, peninsulas and island chains, back then there were sheer cliffs, vast stretches of desert running into the sea, and swamplands teeming with life beside tropical jungles. As the supercontinent eventually cracked apart, these once simple coastlines became jagged and intricate, forming the familiar shapes of continents and ocean boundaries that we can trace on a globe today. The climate of Pangea was equally dramatic. Near the coastlines, the weather was warm, moist, and full of life. Thick forests blanketed the land, creating rich habitats for plants and animals. But the interior of the supercontinent told a different story. Far from the cooling influence of the oceans, the central lands became arid wastelands. Immense deserts stretched farther than the eye could see, rivaling the size of today's Sahara Desert. This striking contrast between lush, humid edges and barren, scorching interiors gave rise to diverse species, each adapting to its unique environment. Over the span of millions upon millions of years, as tectonic plates continued to move, the great supercontinent was slowly pulled apart. The Atlantic Ocean began to open like a widening crack in the Earth's surface, separating land masses that were once joined. With this change, coastlines shifted, ecosystems transformed, and entirely new opportunities for life began to appear. It was this never-ending cycle of creation and destruction that shaped the world we live in today. The birth of mountain ranges during the age of Pangea is one of the most striking examples of Earth's creative power. The Appalachian Mountains, ancient and weathered though they may be today, first rose during this time. Their peaks were once sharp and towering, born from the unimaginable pressure of colliding plates. Across the ocean, the Caledonian Mountains in what is now Scotland and Scandinavia formed in a similar way, a reminder that these distant lands were once connected. These ranges stand as stone monuments to a time when the Earth's crust was constantly reshaping itself. Pangea also gave rise to immense deserts. Without oceans nearby to bring rain, the heart of the supercontinent dried into a vast sea of sand and rock. At the same time, swampy regions thrived along the coasts, filled with thick vegetation. From these lush and waterlogged areas came massive deposits of coal, a treasure chest of fossil fuels that humans still mine today. Each piece of coal is a silent record of forests that grew and decayed hundreds of millions of years ago. Eventually, about 150 million years ago, Pangea began to break apart in earnest. The pieces of this supercontinent drifted, and as they collided again in new ways, they gave rise to other mountain ranges such as the Rocky Mountains in North America, the towering Andes in South America, and the mighty Himalayas in Asia. Each of these ranges is part of the continuing story that began with Pangea, the story of a restless planet whose surface is always shifting, never at peace. Today, geologists use clever methods to uncover this deep history. They study rocks, matching types and layers found on different continents like puzzle pieces that once fit together. By examining fossils, they discover creatures such as the Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile whose remains are found in both South America and Africa, clear proof that these lands were once side by side. They also use radiometric dating to measure the ages of the rocks, placing events on a timeline that stretches back hundreds of millions of years. In recent decades, new technology has added even more detail to the story. Scientists now use powerful computers to simulate the movements of tectonic plates over deep time, watching digital continents drift, collide, and reshape the planet. These models bring the ancient world to life and help us understand how the Earth has always been and will always remain in motion. The climate during Pangea periods in the distant past could be extraordinarily harsh and unforgiving. A world where extreme heat dominated, where dryness was relentless, and where the weather seemed to follow no predictable rhythm. The sun itself appeared merciless, casting its light upon vast expanses of land that stretched uninterrupted for hundreds of millions of square miles. Day after day, the heat baked the surfaces of continents, and the ground cracked under the unrelenting sun. This was a world where water was scarce, and rivers, lakes, and streams were often temporary, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Even areas that might today seem to be fertile were parched and cracked, turning once lush regions into deserts of dust and sand. The soil, exposed to the unbroken sunlight and without the protection of thick vegetation, became hard and barren, leaving only a few hardy plants able to survive. Small shrubs and tough fibrous plants struggled to cling to the earth, their roots penetrating deep into the parched ground in search of the faintest traces of moisture. These plants grew slowly, often taking many years to reach even a few feet in height, and many would not survive the sudden and severe changes in temperature that could sweep across the land. During these times, heat was not just an occasional discomfort, it was a dominating force that shaped every aspect of life. The air itself could feel heavy and dry, carrying with it particles of dust and sand that whirled across the land. These airborne particles could irritate the skin and eyes, making life even more difficult for animals and early forms of human-like creatures. Daytime temperatures could rise to levels that made survival a daily struggle, while nights offered only a slight relief. Even the cooler hours of darkness could not remove the heat trapped in rocks and soil, and temperatures might fall only slightly before the sun rose again, relentless in its intensity. Heat waves, lasting for days or even weeks, could strike without warning, leaving streams dry, plants withered, and the creatures that relied on them desperate for survival. Such extreme heat influenced not just the daily lives of the living beings, but also their very evolution, as species developed adaptations specifically to survive in these punishing conditions. The dryness of the climate added another layer of difficulty. Rainfall was infrequent and erratic, sometimes falling in sudden and violent storms before disappearing entirely for months at a time. When rain did arrive, it often came in torrents that the parched ground could not absorb, causing sudden floods that would sweep away whatever weak plants or unprotected animals lay in their path. These floods could carve deep gullies and canyons into the earth, leaving scars on the landscape that could persist for millions of years. Between the storms, long periods of drought dominated, stretching on for years and leaving waterholes empty and vegetation scarce. Animals had to travel great distances in search of water, and competition for these limited resources could be fierce, often leading to conflicts and struggles for survival. The scarcity of water affected not only the living creatures, but also the soil itself, making it more compacted and less able to support plant life. Over time, these cycles of drought and flood created a harsh rhythm that shaped the ecosystems of the time, selecting for species capable of enduring the extremes. The unpredictability of the weather compounded these problems. There were no clear seasons or reliable patterns. One year might bring a brief intense rain followed by years of scorching heat, while another could bring sudden frost or unexpected storms. This uncertainty meant that plants could not predict when they might receive water, and animals could not know when to migrate or reproduce. Crops, if any existed, could fail without warning, and the timing of reproduction for many species had to adapt to these shifting conditions. Some creatures evolved to store water internally, or to burrow underground to escape the heat and dryness, while others developed tough, scaly skin or thick coats to protect themselves from the sun. Migration patterns could span hundreds or even thousands of miles, as animals moved in search of food and water, following the irregular and unpredictable cycles of the climate. Wind played a significant role in shaping this unforgiving environment. Fierce gusts would sweep across deserts and plains, moving sand and dust in clouds that could reduce visibility to nearly zero. These winds could strip moisture from plants and soil, increasing the dryness and further challenging survival. The constant movement of sand also reshaped the land, creating ever-changing dunes and shifting ridges that could bury existing vegetation and force animals to adapt quickly. In coastal regions, storms could bring powerful winds from the oceans, driving waves onto the land and causing erosion that reshaped coastlines over time. Even far from the seas, wind could carve intricate patterns into rock and soil, leaving behind landscapes both beautiful and treacherous. The extreme heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather patterns influenced every living thing. Plants that survived developed thick, waxy leaves to retain water or deep roots to reach underground reserves. Trees, where they existed, grew slowly and often had sparse foliage, conserving energy and moisture to endure the harsh conditions. Some species produced seeds capable of remaining dormant for years, waiting for the rare rains that would allow them to germinate and grow. Animals developed a wide range of adaptations, Some became nocturnal to avoid the blazing sun, emerging only after sunset to hunt or forage, while others developed specialized body parts to store water, dissipate heat, or camouflage themselves against the stark landscape. Insects and smaller creatures often burrowed underground, hiding from the heat and emerging only during cooler periods or after rainfall. Predators, in turn, adapted their hunting strategies to track prey across vast and unforgiving terrains, learning to survive in a world where sustenance was scarce and conditions were severe. Large-scale environmental changes were also driven by this harsh climate. Glacial and interglacial periods could occur even in regions dominated by heat, as shifts in the Earth's orbit or volcanic activity affected global temperatures and weather patterns. Volcanic eruptions released vast amounts of ash and gases into the atmosphere, which could temporarily block sunlight and cause dramatic drops in temperature. In some cases, these eruptions combined with the already extreme heat and dryness to create conditions of famine and mass die-offs. Forests could be consumed by wildfires sparked by lightning or dry conditions, leaving behind scorched landscapes and ash-laden air. These fires sometimes created fertile soils in their aftermath, but the immediate destruction could wipe out entire communities of plants and animals, forcing survivors to migrate or adapt quickly. Over time, these events became a driving force for evolution, favouring species that could endure both the extreme heat of the sun and the sudden violent disruptions of storms and fires. The land itself reflected the cruelty of the climate. Rocky outcrops and bare cliffs rose above deserts, their surfaces bleached by the relentless sun. Sand and dust covered plains, forming shifting dunes that could swallow entire landscapes. Rivers, when they existed, were often seasonal, swelling with brief rains and then shrinking to small pools or vanishing entirely. Lakes and wetlands appeared suddenly, teeming with life for a short period before drying up completely, leaving cracked and salt-encrusted beds. Even mountains and highlands were affected, as the intense sunlight and dry air prevented the accumulation of snow and ice, except at the highest elevations. The land was in a constant state of change, shaped by wind, heat, and water, in ways that could be sudden and dramatic. Valleys could be carved in a matter of months during intense rainstorms, while wind could move sand and soil over decades, altering the appearance and habitability of regions. Over millions of years, these forces created landscapes that were both beautiful and brutal, a testament to the power of climate to shape the Earth. Life in such a world required constant vigilance and adaptation. Creatures had to be alert for sudden changes in temperature or the appearance of a rare storm. Finding water could mean travelling long distances across exposed and sun-baked land, while avoiding predators required constant awareness and strategy. Plants had to survive without relying on predictable rainfall, often producing seeds that waited years for the opportunity to sprout. Reproduction itself was a gamble. If conditions were unfavourable, eggs, seeds, or young offspring might not survive. Over long periods, these pressures shaped the behaviour and physiology of every species, creating forms of life that were remarkably resilient but also highly specialised. Some species flourished during brief periods of favourable weather, only to decline when conditions turned harsh again, creating cycles of abundance and scarcity that defined life on Earth. Even the oceans and seas were affected by extreme heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather patterns. Evaporation increased, raising salinity levels in shallow waters and creating harsh conditions for marine life. Coral reefs, where they existed, could bleach and die during periods of intense heat, leaving only the hardiest species to survive. Ocean currents, influenced by temperature differences, became less stable, causing shifts in nutrient distribution and affecting the availability of food for fish and other marine creatures. Storms arising from the ocean could strike suddenly, bringing destructive winds and waves to coastal regions and reshaping the landscape. These unpredictable changes in the oceans mirrored the challenges faced on land, creating a world in which survival depended on flexibility, adaptation, and endurance. Volcanic activity, tectonic shifts, and meteorite impacts could exacerbate these harsh conditions. Ash and dust from volcanic eruptions blocked sunlight, temporarily cooling the earth, but often causing acid rain that harmed plants and animals. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions could change the flow of rivers and create new lakes or destroy old ones. Meteorite impacts, while rare, could have catastrophic local effects, triggering fires, storms, and floods. In a world already dominated by extreme heat and dryness, these sudden events added another layer of unpredictability and danger. Life had to endure not only the daily challenges of sun, wind, and drought, but also the occasional extraordinary disaster that could reshape entire regions. The interplay between heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather created a feedback loop that intensified the challenges. Dry soils reflected sunlight, increasing local temperatures, while the lack of vegetation allowed more heat to penetrate the ground. Strong winds carried dust and sand over long distances, reducing air quality and further stressing living creatures. When rain did fall, it could cause sudden erosion, removing topsoil and leaving the land even less able to support plant life. Rivers that once sustained life could dry up almost overnight, and small animals might perish without the ability to migrate quickly enough. These processes operated over decades, centuries, and even millions of years, continuously shaping ecosystems and forcing life to adapt to an environment that was both extreme and unpredictable. Insects, reptiles, and small mammals developed clever strategies to survive these conditions. Many insects could enter states of dormancy, slowing their metabolism until conditions improved. Reptiles, with their scaly skin and ability to regulate body temperature in sunlight, were better suited than most animals to endure prolonged heat and scarce water. Small mammals might burrow underground, creating cool, humid refuges in the soil where temperatures were lower and moisture was retained. Birds and larger animals often migrated vast distances, following seasonal or irregular patterns dictated not by fixed calendars, but by the availability of water and food. These adaptations were not merely survival strategies. They became defining characteristics of species, shaping evolution in ways that would persist for millions of years. Over time, these harsh climates influenced the arrangement of ecosystems across continents. Forests were restricted to areas where water could be relied upon, often near rivers or lakes that were replenished regularly. Grasslands, deserts, and scrublands expanded in regions where rainfall was insufficient or unpredictable. In each of these zones, life found ways to endure, but only those capable of tolerating extreme heat, enduring long periods of dryness, or adapting to sudden changes in weather survived and reproduced. This created a patchwork of habitats, each with its own challenges, yet all shaped by the same forces of sun, wind, heat, and water scarcity. The creatures of these lands, from the smallest insect to the largest predator, were bound by the same unforgiving climate, and their very existence was a testament to the ability of life to adapt in the face of relentless adversity. The climate also influenced social and behavioural patterns among species that lived in groups. Herds of animals might cluster near the few remaining water sources, leading to competition and complex interactions within and between species. Predators learned to anticipate the movements of prey, while prey species developed heightened senses and defensive strategies to survive in open, exposed landscapes. Cooperation and competition existed side by side, dictated by the scarcity of resources and the unpredictability of the weather. Even species that were capable of flight had to contend with windstorms, dust clouds, and sudden temperature shifts, which could affect migration routes and breeding cycles. Fire, driven by heat and dryness, became a constant presence in many ecosystems. Natural ignitions from lightning could spark wildfires that swept across grasslands and forests, consuming plants and driving animals to seek refuge. While devastating in the short term, these fires sometimes created opportunities for new growth, clearing old vegetation and allowing hardy species to take root. Fire-adapted plants developed thick bark or seeds resistant to heat, while animals developed the ability to flee or burrow to escape the flames. Over long periods, fire became an integral part of the landscape, shaping ecosystems in combination with heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather. The interplay of all these factors created a planet in which survival was never guaranteed. Life had to endure searing heat, prolonged droughts, sudden storms, high winds, and the occasional volcanic eruption or meteorite impact. Every organism, from the smallest microorganism to the largest predator, had to find ways to persist, adapting its behaviour, physiology, and reproductive strategies to the harsh and unforgiving climate. Over millions of years, These challenges shaped evolution, forcing life to become resilient, resourceful, and highly specialized. The fossil record preserves traces of this struggle, showing how species rose and fell in response to the extremes of their environment. Layers of sediment reveal periods of heat and drought, interspersed with evidence of sudden floods or fires. Plant imprints, fossilized skeletons, and ancient soils all tell the story of a world dominated by a climate that was both beautiful in its grandeur and relentless in its cruelty. The Earth's climate during these periods was not static. It shifted, oscillated, and sometimes changed dramatically over short spans of geological time. These changes were influenced by the movement of continents, the positions of oceans, variations in solar radiation, and fluctuations in atmospheric gases. As continents shifted, rain patterns changed, deserts expanded or contracted, and oceans redistributed heat around the planet. Such large-scale changes affected the day-to-day lives of every species, requiring constant adaptation. Creatures that thrived during one climate regime could struggle or perish when conditions shifted, while others evolved new traits that allowed them to flourish in the new environment. In this way, extreme heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather were not merely environmental challenges, but powerful forces driving the evolution and distribution of life across the planet. The relentless sun, the parched soils, the sudden storms, and the sweeping winds combined to create a world that tested every living organism. Plants, animals, and microorganisms alike developed remarkable strategies to endure. Survival depended on being prepared for extremes, from droughts lasting years to floods lasting weeks, from calm, scorching days to fierce, storm-tossed nights. Life persisted, evolved, and adapted, creating ecosystems both fragile and robust, intricate and simple, all under the watchful, unforgiving eye of a climate that brooked no weakness. The story of Earth during these times is a story of endurance, adaptation, and the continual struggle to survive in a world defined by extreme heat, dryness, and unpredictable weather. A world where the forces of nature were both the ultimate challenge and the ultimate sculptor of life itself. The wind, the sun, and the scarcity of water also shaped the behaviors of reproductive cycles and social structures among early life forms. Plants developed mechanisms to release seeds during the brief periods of rainfall, while animals timed breeding to maximize the chance of offspring survival. Seasonal migrations became irregular yet crucial as populations shifted across vast distances in response to rainfall patterns that could not be predicted from one year to the next. Territories expanded and contracted according to the availability of resources, and hierarchies within animal groups could change rapidly depending on access to water and food. Even seemingly simple life forms, like insects and amphibians, showed astonishing resilience, burrowing, hiding, or entering dormant states during prolonged dry periods and emerging rapidly when conditions became favourable. Dust storms and sandstorms were constant hazards in many regions. These storms could last for hours or days, reducing visibility to a few feet and making travel dangerous. They stripped moisture from soil, buried vegetation, and sometimes reshaped the landscape entirely. Animals caught in these storms faced suffocation, disorientation, or injury, while plants were often scorched and covered with layers of abrasive sand. Yet life found ways to persist. Seeds could remain dormant beneath the surface, burrows offered shelter for animals, and specialized leaf structures allowed some plants to survive despite the sandblasting. These natural challenges added another layer of pressure on species, driving the evolution of traits specifically aimed at enduring harsh winds and abrasive particles. Even the skies above reflected the cruelty of the climate. Clouds, when they appeared, could bring sudden and violent storms, dropping rain in torrents that quickly evaporated under the blazing sun. Lightning strikes ignited fires in dry vegetation, while dust and smoke from wildfires could spread for hundreds of miles, affecting air quality and creating dramatic red and orange skies. The unpredictability of these events forced creatures to adapt quickly, develop warning systems, or seek immediate shelter. Over time, these conditions favoured species that could respond rapidly to changing environmental threats, making flexibility and adaptability essential for survival. Across the continents, life was continually tested by these extremes. Forests were rare and often confined to river valleys or coastal areas where water was more dependable. grasslands and deserts dominated the interior of continents, where heat and dryness made survival challenging. Rivers and lakes appeared unpredictably, often in response to sudden rainfall, and their temporary abundance supported bursts of growth and reproduction among plants and animals. Life forms evolved to exploit these fleeting opportunities, reproducing quickly, storing resources, or moving swiftly to take advantage of favourable conditions. This dynamic created ecosystems that were both fragile and resilient, capable of rapid growth and sudden collapse, all under the pressure of extreme heat, persistent dryness, and unpredictable weather patterns. The combined effect of these forces created an ever-changing mosaic of habitats and life forms. Organisms adapted to survive in deserts developed entirely different strategies from those in temperate wetlands, mountainous regions, or coastal plains. The continuous pressure of the climate influenced migration, predation, competition, and reproduction in ways that shaped entire lineages over millions of years. Life became a continuous cycle of challenge and adaptation, with survival dependent on the ability to endure extremes, exploit fleeting opportunities, and respond to sudden, sometimes catastrophic changes. This harsh and unforgiving climate, dominated by relentless heat, persistent dryness, and unpredictable weather, shaped not just the physical landscape, but the very nature of life itself, fostering resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to persist against overwhelming odds. This climate, extreme in every sense, continued to influence Earth's landscapes and ecosystems for millions of years. It left behind a world of deserts and arid plains, mountains stripped of vegetation, riverbeds scarred by periodic floods, and soils baked by the sun and wind. Species that endured these conditions became highly specialized, their survival strategies embedded in their physiology, behaviors, and reproductive cycles. Fossils reveal these adaptations in fine detail. The shape of leaves, the structure of roots, the forms of bones, and the patterns of wear on teeth all tell a story of life molded by heat, dryness, and the unpredictability of weather. Even microscopic organisms preserved in sedimentary layers show evidence of resilience and adaptation to extreme conditions. Over geological time, this harsh climate set the stage for the rise and fall of countless species. Periods of relative calm allowed life to flourish temporarily. The supercontinent of Pangea, which existed around 300 million years ago, was an extraordinary and unique landmass that held nearly all of the Earth's continents together as a single massive entity. Its formation brought together lands that we now know as North and South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, and other smaller regions into one gigantic landmass that stretched across the planet. While we often imagine Pangea as a flat, barren expanse of land, it was anything but lifeless. In fact, it was home to a rich and diverse variety of life forms, both plant and animal, each uniquely adapted to the extraordinary and sometimes harsh conditions of this vast supercontinent. The flora and fauna of Pangea provide us with a window into a world long gone, a world that was at once familiar in its life forms yet alien in its landscapes, climates, and ecosystems. To truly understand the living tapestry of Pangea, we must journey through its sprawling forests, its scorching deserts, its swampy wetlands, and its turbulent coastlines, exploring the complex interplay between its living organisms and the land they inhabited. The plant life of Pangea was both abundant and remarkably varied, covering every corner of the supercontinent in green expanses that could range from dense, shadowy forests to open plains dotted with hardy shrubs. In the northern regions, where the climate was cooler and rainfall more frequent, immense forests of ferns, horsetails, and club mosses dominated the landscape. These plants, some of which could grow to towering heights of over 100 feet, formed thick canopies that shaded the forest floors, creating dark, humid habitats where smaller plants and countless invertebrates thrived. The ferns of Pangea were not the delicate fronds that we see today. Many were robust, woody plants with large, intricate leaves that captured sunlight efficiently and provided shelter for countless creatures. Horsetails, often mistaken for simple reeds or grasses, were actually complex, ancient plants that thrived in the wet soils along rivers and lakes, their hollow, jointed stems rising in dense clusters that could stretch for miles. Club mosses, which might seem small and inconspicuous to modern eyes, were during this time the giants of the plant kingdom, forming tree-like structures that could rival the size of present-day pine trees. Together, these plants created forests that were not only beautiful, but also crucial to the survival of many animal species, providing both food and shelter in a world that was still finding its ecological balance. Moving further south, the climate of Pangea became warmer and drier, giving rise to different types of vegetation that were adapted to arid conditions. Vast stretches of conifers and seed ferns dominated these regions, their tough leaves and deep roots allowing them to survive in areas where water was scarce and the sun burned fiercely from overhead. Seed ferns, which were a unique group of plants that combined features of both ferns and modern seed plants, were particularly remarkable. They reproduced using seeds rather than spores, a revolutionary adaptation that allowed them to spread across drier lands and survive periods of drought. Conifers, which included early relatives of modern pines and cypresses, had needle-like leaves coated with a waxy substance to prevent water loss, and their cones produced seeds that could endure long periods before germinating. These plants not only shaped the landscapes of Pangea, but also laid the foundation for future forests that would continue to evolve long after the supercontinent itself had begun to break apart. Alongside these large forests and dry plains, wetlands and swampy areas were common in low-lying regions and along the edges of rivers and lakes. These wetlands were home to another layer of plant life, including tall, reed-like plants and an abundance of mosses and ferns that thrived in the damp, nutrient-rich soils. The wetlands were vital ecological hubs, supporting both plant and animal life by providing water, shelter, and breeding grounds. Giant club moss trees often rose from these swamps, their massive roots anchoring them in the soft soil, and their branches providing shade and habitat for smaller plants and early animals. The wetlands of Pangea were not static. They changed with the seasons, swelling with rainfall and receding during drier periods, creating a dynamic environment that encouraged adaptability among the plants and animals that lived there. The coastal regions and river valleys of Pangea were no less alive, hosting a mixture of plant species that could tolerate both flooding and saltwater exposure. Early mangrove-like plants and salt-tolerant ferns grew along estuaries and tidal flats, their roots stabilizing the soil and preventing erosion while offering hiding places for juvenile fish and amphibians. Along rivers, trees with strong, sprawling root systems lined the banks, providing shade and shelter for both aquatic and terrestrial animals. These areas were rich in nutrients carried by the flowing waters, allowing plants to grow densely and sustain a wide variety of life. In these lush corridors, life was particularly vibrant, with competition for sunlight, water, and space shaping the evolution of plant species over millions of years. While the plant life of Pangea was remarkable in its diversity and adaptability, the animal life was equally fascinating. The supercontinent was home to a wide array of creatures, ranging from tiny invertebrates to massive reptiles, each filling a particular ecological niche in this ancient world. In the forests of the northern regions, early amphibians thrived, taking advantage of the abundant water sources and moist soils. These amphibians, some of which could reach lengths of several feet, were the first vertebrates to establish themselves both in water and on land. They fed on insects, small fish, and other invertebrates, playing a crucial role in controlling populations and maintaining ecological balance. Alongside them, primitive reptiles began to appear, slowly evolving features that would eventually allow them to dominate drier habitats as well. The deserts and dry plains of southern Pangea were inhabited by early reptiles that were remarkably well adapted to the harsh conditions. These creatures, some of which were ancestors of modern lizards and snakes, had tough, scaly skin to prevent water loss and were able to extract moisture efficiently from the food they consumed. In addition to these smaller reptiles, Pangea was home to some of the earliest large terrestrial predators, which prowled the arid landscapes in search of prey. These predators were often swift and agile, with sharp teeth and strong jaws, capable of hunting a variety of animals ranging from insects to smaller reptiles. The interplay between predator and prey created a delicate balance that allowed ecosystems to remain stable, even in the face of extreme environmental conditions. Wetlands and river valleys supported a different caste of animals, many of which relied on water for survival. Fish, both freshwater and early brackish species, populated the rivers and lakes, feeding on plants, smaller invertebrates, and each other. Amphibians and semi-aquatic reptiles were also abundant, taking advantage of the plentiful water while venturing onto land to feed and breed. The wetlands were teeming with insects, some of which grew to enormous sizes compared to their modern descendants, providing a rich food source for birds and early insect-eating reptiles. Insects played a particularly important role in the ecosystems of Pangea, pollinating plants, decomposing organic matter, and serving as a vital link in the food chain. The sheer abundance and variety of insects contributed to the complexity and resilience of these ancient habitats. The skies above Pangea were alive as well, with early flying reptiles and insects carving out niches in the aerial environment. The first true flying reptiles, which evolved from small, agile ancestors, had wingspans that allowed them to glide over forests, deserts, and wetlands, hunting insects and smaller animals or scavenging for food. Dragonfly-like insects, some with wingspans of over 2 feet, dominated the skies, their powerful flight allowing them to evade predators and hunt effectively. These aerial creatures not only added a new dimension to the ecosystems of Pangea, but also helped shape the evolution of plants, as some insects became early pollinators, facilitating the spread of seeds and contributing to the diversification of plant life. Coastal and marine environments were equally bustling with life. Pangea's seas were home to early fish, mollusks, and other invertebrates, as well as some of the first large marine predators. Coral-like structures, formed by colonies of tiny animals, provided shelter and breeding grounds for countless smaller creatures. Along the coastlines, birds and early pterosaur-like reptiles nested in cliffs and trees, taking advantage of abundant food sources in both the land and sea. The interactions between land, freshwater, and marine ecosystems created a web of life that was both complex and interdependent, with energy flowing through the food chains in intricate and fascinating ways. One of the most remarkable aspects of Pangea's flora and fauna was their adaptability. Life on this supercontinent had to contend with enormous temperature variations, ranging from freezing conditions in some northern regions to blistering heat in southern deserts. Seasonal changes brought periods of drought and flooding, forcing plants and animals to develop strategies for survival. Some plants grew deep roots to reach underground water sources, while others produced seeds that could lie dormant until favourable conditions returned. Animals, too, evolved behaviours to cope with environmental extremes, such as burrowing to escape heat, migrating to find food and water, or developing efficient ways to conserve moisture. These adaptations not only ensured survival, but also drove evolutionary change, leading to the emergence of new species and the gradual shaping of the ecosystems that would persist long after Pangea began to break apart. The supercontinent also offered unique opportunities for the movement and spread of species. Because nearly all of the Earth's land was connected, plants and animals could migrate across vast distances, colonizing new habitats and encountering different climates and ecological challenges. This connectivity allowed for unprecedented diversity, as species that evolved in one region could spread to others, sometimes encountering new competitors, predators, or environmental pressures that would drive further adaptation. The movement of species across Pangea was a dynamic and ongoing process, shaping the distribution of life in ways that would leave a lasting legacy even after the continents began to drift apart. Fossil evidence from Pangea provides a vivid record of this extraordinary diversity. Fossils of plants, from towering club mosses to delicate ferns, reveal the richness of the vegetation that once blanketed the supercontinent. Fossilized remains of early reptiles, amphibians, and insects show the wide range of life forms that thrived in different environments, from lush forests to arid plains. Tracks, burrows, and other trace fossils offer glimpses into the behavior of these ancient creatures, illustrating how they hunted, traveled, and interacted with their surroundings. Together, these fossils paint a picture of a living, breathing world that was dynamic, interconnected, and full of surprises. It is important to recognize that the flora and fauna of Pangea were not static. Over millions of years, ecosystems shifted in response to changing climates, volcanic activity, and the gradual movement of the Earth's crust. Species evolved new forms, some disappeared, and others emerged to fill vacant ecological roles. This constant change created a dynamic and resilient biosphere, capable of withstanding challenges and adapting to new conditions. The story of Pangea's life is therefore one of both stability and change, a balance between enduring forms and the relentless push of evolution that shaped the world we know today. Imagine a world very different from the one we know today. A world where a single giant landmass stretched across the globe, where the air was heavy and filled with the scent of decay, and where life teetered on the edge of survival. This was the Earth during the late Permian period, over 250 million years ago. It was a time that would mark one of the deadliest chapters in our planet's history, a time when life, both great and small, faced pressures that pushed it to the brink of extinction. To understand this period, we must first imagine the planet itself, for the Earth of the late Permian was unlike anything we experience now. Back then, almost all the continents we know today were fused together into one enormous supercontinent called Pangea. This single landmass stretched from the icy polar regions to the tropics near the equator, creating extreme environmental conditions across its vast expanse. The interior of Pangea, far from the ocean's moderating influence, was an enormous desert, stretching thousands of miles, where temperatures could soar to levels that made survival extremely difficult. Life in these central regions faced long periods of drought, fierce heat, and limited access to water. Meanwhile, along the coasts, where the seas reached inland, life had slightly better conditions, but it was still far from easy. The late Permian period is often remembered because it culminated in the greatest mass extinction event in the history of Earth. Scientists estimate that about 90% of all marine species and 75% of land species disappeared during this time. To put this into perspective, imagine a world teeming with life, full of strange and wonderful creatures, suddenly losing nearly all of its inhabitants in a relatively short span of geological time. The causes of this catastrophe were complex and intertwined, but they left behind a record that continues to fascinate scientists today. The harshest conditions struck around 252 million years ago, at the very end of the Permian period. This final chapter, known as the end-Permian extinction, was not a single, instantaneous event. Rather, it unfolded over thousands of years, a slow, relentless unravelling of ecosystems. The first signs of trouble appear in the fossil record several million years earlier, when certain groups of animals and plants began to decline. Evidence from ancient sediments shows that the oceans were warming, oxygen levels were dropping, and volcanic activity was increasing. One of the main drivers of the deadly conditions during this period was volcanic activity in a region known today as Siberia. The eruptions there were unlike anything most creatures had ever faced. They lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, releasing massive quantities of lava that spread over millions of square miles. Along with molten rock, the volcanoes spewed vast amounts of gases, including carbon dioxide and methane. These gases trapped heat in the atmosphere, triggering a kind of runaway warming that made the land and seas inhospitable. The consequences of this volcanic activity were devastating. Ocean temperatures rose sharply, causing massive die-offs of marine life. Coral reefs, which had flourished for millions of years, collapsed. Shallow seas that had once supported diverse ecosystems became lifeless. The warmer waters also lost oxygen, creating vast dead zones where very few creatures could survive. In these zones, even the hardiest fish, trilobites, and other invertebrates struggled to breathe and find food. On land, the story was equally grim. The heat and drought made vast regions uninhabitable. Forests that had covered the supercontinent were destroyed, and the plants that survived were often stunted, twisted, or burned by wildfires. Early reptiles, amphibians, and insects had to endure temperatures that could spike above what their bodies could tolerate. Many species went extinct because they could not adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing climate. Fossil evidence suggests that soil erosion and dust storms became common, further reducing the chances of survival for the remaining plants and animals. Another factor contributing to the harsh conditions was the release of methane from the seafloor. As ocean temperatures rose, frozen methane deposits under the sediments melted and released their gas into the atmosphere. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, even more potent than carbon dioxide, and its sudden release amplified the warming effect, pushing temperatures even higher. Some estimates suggest that global temperatures may have risen by as much as 10 degrees Celsius during this time, creating conditions that were almost unbearable for life on Earth. The late Permian period also saw dramatic changes in sea levels. Rising temperatures caused polar ice caps to melt, if any remained, and the movement of tectonic plates reshaped coastlines and shallow seas. The combination of heat, changing sea levels, and reduced oxygen levels created perfect conditions for extinction events to occur in waves. Life was being pushed into small refuges, areas where conditions were slightly better, and these refuges became crowded and fiercely competitive. Many species that had survived for millions of years ultimately could not find a safe haven and disappeared forever. The timeline of this deadly period shows multiple stages of environmental stress. The first phase involved long-term warming and changes in ocean chemistry, leading to the gradual decline of many marine species. This phase lasted hundreds of thousands of years, a slow, creeping threat that weakened ecosystems. The second phase, marked by the massive Siberian eruptions, unleashed catastrophic environmental changes in a relatively short time. During this phase, the extinction rate accelerated dramatically. Finally, the third phase involved the after effects: toxic atmospheres, poisoned waters, and unstable climates that continued to challenge life for thousands of years afterward. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how life eventually recovered. The aftermath of the late Permian extinction set the stage for the rise of new species. With so many ecological niches emptied, survivors had the opportunity to diversify and evolve into new forms. The Triassic period, which followed the Permian, saw the emergence of the first true dinosaurs, as well as the ancestors of modern mammals and reptiles. But this recovery was slow. It took millions of years for life to regain the diversity and abundance that had existed before the catastrophe. Fossils from the late Permian period provide a window into the suffering and survival of life during this time. Fossilized plants show signs of stress, such as smaller leaves or stunted growth. Marine fossils reveal species that suddenly disappear from the record, evidence of abrupt extinction events. In some locations, scientists have uncovered boundary layers in the rocks, where tiny particles from volcanic eruptions and chemical changes in the oceans mark the exact moment when conditions became deadly. These layers serve as historical markers, helping researchers reconstruct the timeline of the Earth's harshest days. In addition to fossils, chemical evidence in rocks gives clues about the extreme conditions. High levels of carbon isotopes indicate massive releases of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Sulfur deposits point to widespread volcanic activity and acid rain. Oxygen levels in sediments show that the seas were often starved of the gas that marine life needed to survive. Together, these clues paint a picture of a planet under stress, struggling against forces far larger than any individual species could endure. Life during the late Permian was also marked by dramatic adaptations and desperate strategies. Some animals developed protective shells or burrowing behaviors to escape heat and predators. Certain plants evolved to tolerate drought or poor soil conditions. Insects and small reptiles diversified rapidly, taking advantage of niches left vacant by extinct species. Yet, despite these adaptations, survival was a constant challenge, and many species disappeared entirely. Interestingly, not all regions of the Earth were equally affected. Some areas, closer to the coasts or in higher latitudes, experienced slightly milder conditions. These regions acted as refuges, where life clung on and provided the seeds for future recovery. The pattern of survival and extinction was uneven, creating a patchwork of ecological collapse and resilience across the supercontinent. Scientists studying the late Permian period also find lessons for our modern world. The rapid warming, extreme volcanic activity, and massive release of greenhouse gases mirror some of the environmental challenges we face today. While the scale and speed of today's changes are different, the end Permian extinction reminds us of how sensitive life on Earth can be to environmental stress. It shows the delicate balance required for ecosystems to thrive and the potential consequences when that balance is disrupted. In conclusion, the late Permian period was a time of unprecedented danger and struggle for life on Earth. From the interior deserts of Pangea to the warming seas and volcanic landscapes of Siberia, life faced relentless challenges. The deadliest conditions struck around 252 million years ago, during the end Permian extinction, a catastrophic event that wiped out the majority of species on Earth. Volcanic eruptions, methane releases, rising temperatures, ocean acidification, and droughts combined to create an environment almost impossible to survive. Yet even in the face of such extreme conditions, life endured. Tiny pockets of survival allowed species to adapt and eventually repopulate the planet. The late Permian period, though deadly, set the stage for the rise of new life forms and the evolution of ecosystems that would dominate the Mesozoic era. By studying this period, we not only gain insight into the resilience of life, but also a deeper appreciation of the fragile balance that sustains our planet. The Great Dying, often called Earth's worst mass extinction, was a time when the planet suffered a catastrophic collapse of life, unlike anything before or since. It occurred at the end of the Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago. During this period, the Earth's ecosystems were pushed to their absolute limits, and life struggled to survive as the planet itself seemed to rebel against the organisms inhabiting it. The severity of this event was staggering, far surpassing the other 5 major mass extinctions that are recorded in the fossil record. Around 90% of marine species vanished, along with more than 70% of terrestrial vertebrates, leaving vast gaps in the chain of life that would take millions of years to fill again. Entire groups of animals and plants were wiped from the face of the Earth, leaving a stark silence in habitats that had once thrived with abundant life. This extinction event reshaped the course of evolution and fundamentally altered the biological and geological landscape of the planet. The causes of the Great Dying were complex and interconnected, forming a perfect storm of environmental catastrophes. One of the central factors was massive volcanic activity in a region now known as Siberia. These eruptions released immense amounts of lava, covering millions of square kilometers and sending clouds of ash into the atmosphere. Alongside the lava, enormous quantities of gases, including carbon dioxide and methane, were unleashed. These greenhouse gases trapped heat in the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to rise dramatically. The heat alone stressed the planet's ecosystems, making survival increasingly difficult for many species. Oceans, which had previously been the cradle of life for countless marine organisms, became especially hostile. Rising temperatures caused the oceans to lose oxygen, creating vast dead zones where most life could not survive. The warming also disrupted ocean currents, which normally help distribute nutrients, leading to further ecological collapse. The atmosphere itself became toxic in many ways. The gases released from the volcanic eruptions, including sulfur dioxide, formed acid rain that fell across continents. Forests and plants, which had depended on more moderate climates, suffered massive die-offs. Acidic waters and soils destroyed habitats for amphibians, insects, and land plants, weakening the food chains that supported higher life forms. The combination of extreme heat, acid rain, and habitat loss created a situation where survival depended on extraordinary resilience or luck. Those species that could not tolerate even small changes in temperature, oxygen levels, or acidity quickly disappeared. The oceans, which once teemed with life, were hit hardest. Coral reefs, which had supported a dazzling variety of organisms, collapsed. Shelled creatures like brachiopods and ammonites found it increasingly difficult to build and maintain their shells as ocean chemistry changed. Many plankton species, which formed the base of the marine food chain, vanished, triggering cascading extinctions up through fish, reptiles, and the early ancestors of modern mammals. The seas turned into zones of stagnation where life existed only in pockets, struggling against conditions that were lethal to the vast majority of species. Even the deep ocean, which had previously offered refuge, became inhospitable due to low oxygen levels and the spread of toxic hydrogen sulfide, a gas deadly to most animals. Life on land was not spared. Forests receded as climate extremes and volcanic fallout created deserts and barren plains. Large amphibians, which had flourished for millions of years, largely disappeared. Early reptiles fared somewhat better, but even they suffered massive losses. Many plant species went extinct, causing further destabilization of ecosystems. Without vegetation to anchor the soil and provide food, erosion increased, rivers choked with sediment, and the land became increasingly hostile. Carnivorous animals lost their prey, and herbivores lost their food sources, leading to a cascading collapse across the terrestrial world. The speed and scale of the Great Dying were extraordinary. Unlike slower extinctions, which allowed some species to adapt or migrate, this event unfolded over a few 100,000 years, a blink of an eye in geological terms. Fossil records show sudden gaps, with species that had existed for tens of millions of years vanishing almost entirely. The extinction spared no ecosystem. From the shallow seas to the deep ocean, from lush forests to the arid interiors of continents. Even microorganisms were affected. Certain species of plankton and bacteria disappeared, reshaping the chemical and biological makeup of the oceans for millions of years to come. The aftermath of the Great Dying was a world transformed. With the dominant species gone, ecological niches opened, allowing for the rise of new forms of life. The recovery was slow. For millions of years, biodiversity remained low compared to pre-extinction levels. The early Triassic period, which followed immediately after the Permian, was a time of fragile ecosystems, often dominated by a few hardy species that could tolerate extreme conditions. Reptiles began to diversify, laying the foundation for future dominance of dinosaurs. Plant life gradually returned, though many forests were initially sparse and fragile. It took tens of millions of years for complex ecosystems to re-establish, highlighting the immense scale of the Great Dying's impact. Scientists studying this event have found evidence across the globe. In Siberia, layers of volcanic rock reveal the scale of lava flows and the intensity of eruptions. In marine sediments, the abrupt disappearance of fossilized shells marks the timing of mass die-offs. Carbon isotope records show dramatic swings, indicating sudden changes in the carbon cycle and pointing to massive releases of greenhouse gases. Soil and rock layers contain evidence of acid rain and extreme temperatures, confirming the environmental stresses that life endured. By combining these lines of evidence, researchers have reconstructed a picture of a planet in turmoil, one where the survival of life hung by a thread. The Great Dying also left a lasting legacy in the evolution of life. With so many species eliminated, the survivors had less competition and new opportunities to evolve. This event created the stage for the rise of new dominant groups, including archosaurs, which would eventually give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Early mammals, which had been small and inconspicuous, began a slow process of diversification. The extinction reshaped food chains and ecological dynamics, forcing organisms to adapt to new conditions and to fill vacant niches. This evolutionary reset profoundly influenced the course of life on Earth for millions of years. The causes of the Great Dying are still studied today, and scientists debate the relative importance of each factor. Some argue that volcanic activity was the primary driver, while others point to potential asteroid impacts that could have added to the stress. There is also evidence that the release of methane from seafloor deposits, triggered by warming oceans, may have accelerated climate change. The combination of volcanic activity, greenhouse gas buildup, ocean stagnation, acid rain, and habitat destruction created a scenario where few species could survive. It was not a single cause, but rather the convergence of multiple catastrophic processes that made this extinction the most severe in Earth's history. Marine ecosystems illustrate the depth of the catastrophe. Prior to the extinction, oceans were rich with diverse invertebrates, fish, and early reptiles. Coral reefs, sponges, and mollusks formed complex habitats, providing shelter and food for countless species. When oxygen levels fell and toxic gases spread, these habitats collapsed. Fossils show that even previously dominant species disappeared entirely. Brachiopods, once abundant, were almost entirely eliminated. Certain types of trilobites, which had survived previous extinctions, vanished forever. The loss of plankton, which forms the base of the food chain, meant that larger organisms could not sustain themselves, triggering further extinctions up the food web. Terrestrial life faced equally harsh conditions. Amphibians, which had thrived in warm, humid climates, were highly vulnerable to the sudden heat and drying conditions. Large amphibians, such as temnospondyls, suffered enormous losses. Early reptiles, while more resilient to arid conditions, were also heavily impacted. Plant communities collapsed, altering soil structure and reducing available food for herbivores. This domino effect rippled through terrestrial ecosystems, affecting every level of the food chain. In some regions, deserts expanded dramatically, creating barren landscapes that could support only the hardiest of species. The role of carbon dioxide and methane in this event cannot be overstated. Massive volcanic eruptions released these greenhouse gases, which trapped heat in the atmosphere and caused global temperatures to soar. Methane, stored in frozen deposits in the ocean floor, may have been released suddenly as oceans warmed, adding further to the greenhouse effect. As a result, average global temperatures increased by several degrees, creating a hostile environment for most forms of life. High temperatures combined with acid rain, ocean acidification, and low oxygen levels created conditions that were nearly impossible for many species to survive. Hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas produced by bacteria in oxygen-depleted oceans, also played a critical role. When oxygen levels fell, bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide flourished. This gas is lethal to most animals, and its spread into the oceans and possibly into the atmosphere created an additional layer of danger. Evidence from sulfur isotopes suggests that these toxic conditions contributed significantly to marine extinctions. On land, the combination of extreme heat and toxic gases stressed animals and plants alike, pushing many to extinction. The timing of the Great Dying is also crucial to understanding its severity. It occurred over a period of roughly 60,000 to 200,000 years, which is incredibly rapid in geological terms. This speed meant that species had little time to adapt or migrate to safer environments. Fossil records show abrupt shifts, with entire groups disappearing within relatively short spans. This rapidity, combined with the scale of environmental stresses, created a situation where survival depended on extraordinary resilience. The result was a near-total collapse of life on Earth. The aftermath of the Great Dying shaped the trajectory of evolution for millions of years. With dominant groups eliminated, new forms of life emerged to fill the vacant ecological roles. Reptiles, which had been minor players, began to diversify and eventually dominated terrestrial ecosystems. Early mammals, though small, began to exploit new opportunities. Plant life slowly recovered, with gymnosperms becoming more widespread in some regions. Ecosystems gradually became more complex, but biodiversity remained low for millions of years compared to pre-extinction levels. The Great Dying remains a focal point for scientists seeking to understand the limits of life on Earth. By studying this event, researchers gain insights into how ecosystems respond to extreme stress, how climate change affects species survival, and how life recovers after global catastrophes. This mass extinction serves as a stark reminder that even dominant and widespread species are vulnerable when environmental conditions change dramatically. It also illustrates the interconnectedness of life, as the collapse of one group can trigger cascading effects throughout the planet's ecosystems. Even microorganisms were affected, which had long-term implications for the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere. Certain types of plankton and bacteria vanished, altering nutrient cycles and oxygen levels. This reshaping of microbial communities further destabilized ecosystems, showing that no level of life, from microscopic to gigantic, was immune. The recovery of microbial life took thousands of years, highlighting the deep and lasting impact of this extinction. The evidence of the Great Dying can be found on every continent. In South China, sediment layers reveal abrupt changes in fossil content and isotopic signatures. In Antarctica, rocks from the period show signs of warming and volcanic activity. Marine fossils from North America and Europe show sudden disappearances of dominant species, marking the global reach of the extinction. Even today, scientists use these rocks and fossils to piece together the sequence of events, uncovering details about how the planet's climate, oceans, and land were affected. The Great Dying is often described as the most severe crisis in Earth's history, and rightly so. Life on Earth had never been tested on such a scale before. The extinction reshaped the evolutionary path, eliminated dominant groups, and altered the composition of ecosystems worldwide. It serves as both a warning and a lesson, showing how interconnected the planet's systems are and how vulnerable life can be when multiple catastrophic forces converge. The scale of devastation cannot be overstated. 90% of marine species disappeared, including many that had survived previous mass extinctions. Terrestrial vertebrates suffered losses of over 70%, fundamentally altering the face of life on land. Entire ecosystems collapsed, leaving barren landscapes and lifeless oceans. Fossil evidence shows that recovery was slow and uneven, with some groups bouncing back faster than others. The slow pace of recovery underscores the extreme severity of the event, highlighting how fragile life can be under sudden and extreme environmental pressures. Volcanic activity in Siberia remains one of the best documented drivers of this extinction. The lava flows alone covered millions of square kilometers, releasing gases that altered the atmosphere and oceans. Sulfur dioxide contributed to acid rain, while carbon dioxide and methane fueled extreme warming. The scale of these eruptions was unprecedented, creating conditions that no life form had faced before. It is likely that this volcanic activity, combined with other factors such as methane release and ocean stagnation, created a chain reaction that led to the near-total collapse of life. The Great Dying illustrates the delicate balance of life on Earth. When multiple stresses coincide, rising temperatures, toxic gases, habitat loss, and changes in ocean chemistry, the survival of species becomes precarious. Even organisms that had thrived for millions of years were unable to withstand the combined pressures. Those that survived were often small, resilient, or adaptable, able to exploit the few remaining safe niches. The extinction demonstrates how environmental changes ripple through ecosystems, affecting every level of life. Recovery from the Great Dying was slow and uneven. Early Triassic ecosystems were fragile, often dominated by a few hardy species. Reptiles began to diversify, eventually paving the way for the age of dinosaurs. Early mammals slowly exploited ecological opportunities, and plant life gradually recolonized the continents. Coral reefs eventually reappeared, but marine ecosystems took millions of years to regain pre-extinction diversity. The scars of the Great Dying remained visible in the structure of ecosystems for tens of millions of years, showing how deeply this event altered the planet. The Great Dying serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of life on Earth. It demonstrates how extreme environmental changes can lead to rapid and widespread extinctions. It also highlights the resilience of life, as new species emerged and eventually repopulated the planet. The event continues to fascinate scientists because it offers insights into both the fragility and adaptability of life. By studying the Great Dying, we gain a clearer understanding of how Earth systems interact and how life responds to catastrophic challenges, lessons that remain relevant today. Even today, the Great Dying informs our understanding of modern ecological crises. The factors that contributed to this ancient catastrophe, rapid climate change, greenhouse gas buildup, ocean acidification, habitat loss, mirror challenges faced by life on Earth today. While the context is different, the lessons remain profound. Life can endure extreme stress, but the combined pressure of multiple catastrophic forces can overwhelm even the most resilient species. The fossil record, rocks, and isotopes left behind by the Great Dying continue to reveal new details about the severity of this event, reminding us of the immense power of planetary forces and the fragility of life. Life's ability to recover after such devastation underscores the long-term resilience of ecosystems, but the path to recovery was slow, often taking millions of years. The survivors of the Great Dying laid the foundation for the future of life on Earth. Reptiles diversified, mammals slowly evolved, and plant life re-established itself across continents. Coral reefs returned to the seas, and ecosystems gradually became more complex. Yet, even as life returned, the planet was forever changed. The legacy of the Great Dying shaped the evolutionary trajectory of countless species, influencing the development of life for hundreds of millions of years to come. The Great Dying stands as the ultimate testament to the destructive power of nature and the delicate balance required for life to thrive. It shows that even the most dominant species are vulnerable when environmental conditions shift rapidly and catastrophically. It also highlights the interconnectedness of life, as the loss of one group triggers cascading effects throughout ecosystems. This extinction event reshaped the Earth, erased entire branches of life, and created the conditions for new species to rise. It is remembered not only as a period of unparalleled destruction, but also as a turning point that profoundly influenced the history of life on our planet. This extinction event is more than just a historical phenomenon. It is a window into the dynamics of Earth's systems and the fragility of life. It demonstrates that ecosystems are highly sensitive to rapid changes in climate, chemistry, and habitat. It also reveals the resilience of life as the survivors adapted, evolved, and eventually repopulated the planet. The Great Dying reminds us that life is both fragile and persistent, capable of incredible recovery even after near-total collapse. The scars of the Great Dying remain visible in the fossil record. Fossilized shells, bones, and plant remains show the sudden disappearance of species and the profound impact on ecosystems. Chemical signatures in rocks indicate extreme temperature changes, massive volcanic activity, and the release of greenhouse gases. These traces provide a detailed record of the catastrophic conditions that led to the loss of life. By studying these remains, scientists can reconstruct the sequence of events and better understand how life responds to extreme stress. The supercontinent of Pangea, which existed around 300 million years ago, was home to some of the most extreme and vast deserts the Earth has ever known. These deserts were not merely stretches of sand or stone, they were enormous, sprawling landscapes that extended far beyond anything we see on our modern continents today. The sheer size of these deserts was staggering, covering millions of square kilometres and dominating large portions of the central areas of Pangea. Unlike today's deserts, which are often separated by mountains, oceans or rivers, the deserts of Pangea were continuous and uninterrupted, creating a hostile environment that shaped the climate, the living organisms, and even the patterns of wind and rainfall across the entire supercontinent. The heat in these deserts was intense, often rising to levels that would have been unbearable for most forms of life. The sun's rays fell relentlessly on the barren ground, baking the surface and creating vast areas of cracked earth and shifting sands. The air was dry and heavy, carrying dust and fine sand across the desert plains, creating frequent sandstorms that could last for days, sweeping across the land and eroding rock formations in their path. These storms were so powerful that they left marks on the landscape that are still visible in the fossil record today, showing layers of sand and silt that were carried hundreds of kilometres from their origin. Water in these deserts was scarce and precious. Rivers were few and far between, often seasonal, appearing only during rare periods of rainfall. When they did flow, they carried a thin, silty water that would vanish quickly under the scorching sun. Lakes, if they existed at all, were shallow and prone to drying up, leaving behind salt flats and mineral deposits that painted the landscape in brilliant white and orange hues. Despite these harsh conditions, life found ways to persist. Plants that survived were hardy and well adapted to the extreme dryness. Fossil evidence shows that tough, drought-resistant vegetation, including early forms of conifers, ferns and seed ferns, managed to cling to the soil, their roots digging deep to tap into underground moisture. These plants were not plentiful, but they formed small, scattered oases that provided shelter and food for the creatures that roamed the deserts. Early reptiles, small amphibians, and numerous invertebrates inhabited these regions. Their bodies adapted to conserve water and tolerate heat. Some burrowed beneath the surface to escape the sun, while others developed scales or tough skin to reduce water loss. Insects and arthropods thrived in the sand, feeding on the sparse plant life in each other, forming intricate food webs that sustained life in a landscape that seemed almost lifeless. The ground itself was a dynamic surface. Sand dunes moved slowly under the influence of constant winds, reshaping the terrain in patterns that could change within months or years. Rocky outcrops jutted out from the desert floor, remnants of ancient mountains and erosion-resistant formations that offered shelter and shade. The interplay between wind, heat, and erosion created a landscape of constant change, where no single place remained the same for long. Climate patterns in Pangea's super deserts were extreme and unpredictable. Some years might bring brief rains, causing sudden blooms of vegetation and temporary rivers, while other years could see prolonged droughts that made survival a constant struggle. Temperature swings were dramatic, with scorching daytime heat followed by chilling cold at night, testing the resilience of all living organisms. These harsh conditions influenced migration and survival strategies, forcing animals and plants to adapt quickly or perish. The deserts also shaped the larger environment of Pangea. By absorbing vast amounts of solar heat, they influenced wind patterns and the movement of air masses across the supercontinent. This in turn affected rainfall in distant regions, creating a ripple effect that could extend to the coastal areas and mountain ranges of Pangea. These deserts were not isolated. They interacted with the surrounding lands, deserts affecting the climate of forests, river valleys, and even the oceans. The fossil record reveals traces of life struggling against these conditions. Fossils of reptiles with specialized teeth for eating tough, dry plants, and amphibians adapted to temporary water sources are found in ancient desert sediments. Footprints, burrows, and fossilized nests show that animals found ways to shelter themselves from heat and predators, demonstrating resilience and ingenuity in an unforgiving environment. Mineral deposits left behind in these deserts tell stories of drying lakes, evaporating ponds, and shifting sands. Salt layers, gypsum deposits, and sandstone formations provide evidence of ancient conditions, showing how wind, water, and heat sculpted the land over millions of years. The colour and composition of these deposits help scientists reconstruct the appearance of Pangea's deserts, revealing a world of orange and red sands, pale mineral flats, and scattered rocky outcrops. Life in the deserts of Pangea was a delicate balance. Plants needed moisture to survive, yet water was fleeting. Animals depended on plants and each other for food, but the scarcity of resources meant competition was intense. Survival strategies were diverse. Some animals became nocturnal, emerging only at night to avoid the heat. Others travelled great distances to find water. Some evolved protective coverings to retain moisture. Over time, these strategies led to evolutionary changes that would shape the descendants of desert dwellers for millions of years. Winds were a constant force in these deserts, shaping not only the sand dunes but also the climate. Hot, dry winds carried dust across the land, sometimes reaching hundreds of kilometres, affecting air quality and soil conditions even in regions beyond the deserts. The movement of air masses contributed to erosion, transported sediments, and helped form unique geological structures that still fascinate scientists today. These deserts also played a role in global carbon cycles and climate regulation. Sparse vegetation meant that carbon dioxide levels fluctuated differently than in heavily forested regions, affecting atmospheric composition and long-term climate trends. The interaction between deserts, forests, mountains, and oceans created complex feedback systems that influenced weather patterns across the entire supercontinent. Some deserts in central Pangea were likely enormous salt flats, created by repeated cycles of flooding and drying. Seasonal rivers and temporary lakes would deposit minerals, and as the water evaporated, thick layers of salt and gypsum remained. These mineral-rich areas could be hundreds of kilometres across, reflecting sunlight and making the land even hotter during the day. The boundaries of these deserts were not sharply defined. They merged gradually into semi-arid regions, scrublands, and seasonal floodplains. Transitional zones supported a slightly greater diversity of life, including more lush vegetation and a higher density of animals. These areas acted as corridors for migration and sources of genetic exchange between populations, helping maintain biodiversity despite the overall harshness of the environment. Fossilized remains indicate that some early reptiles were specialized for desert life, developing elongated limbs for running across sand, efficient kidneys for conserving water, and behaviors that minimized exposure to the harsh sun. Invertebrates, such as early insects and arachnids, thrived in burrows and under rocks, feeding on plant detritus or smaller animals, contributing to a complex desert ecosystem. The deserts were also a place of geological change. Windblown sand slowly wore down rock formations, creating arches, cliffs, and plateaus. Periodic volcanic activity in some regions added layers of ash and lava, altering soil composition and providing minerals that occasionally supported plant life. Earthquakes, tectonic shifts, and erosion continuously reshaped the landscape over millions of years, making these deserts dynamic, ever-changing environments. The extreme conditions of these deserts meant that life had to adapt quickly or face extinction. Drought-resistant plants evolved deep roots and tough leaves. Animals developed behaviors and physical adaptations to survive heat and scarcity of water. Even small microhabitats, such as shaded crevices, temporary pools, or nutrient-rich soil patches, became crucial for the survival of desert species. Fossilized pollen, spores, and plant impressions provide evidence of these adaptations, showing that life persisted even in a seemingly inhospitable environment. These deserts were not silent. They were shaped by natural forces that interacted constantly. Sand moved with the wind, rivers flowed briefly after rains, animals migrated, and the sun and heat sculpted the land. The deserts of Pangea were living landscapes in their own way, with constant motion and change, a testament to the power of Earth's forces and the resilience of life. The scale of these deserts was unprecedented. Stretching across hundreds of millions of square kilometres, they covered the central part of Pangea, forming a barrier to moisture and creating a rain shadow effect on regions beyond. Coastal areas may have seen more moderate conditions, but the interior deserts remained hot, dry, and inhospitable for most species. The presence of such vast, arid regions influenced evolutionary trajectories, forcing life to adapt to extreme dryness, and shaping the future development of species long after Pangea began to break apart around 200 million years ago. Even as the continents shifted and new oceans formed, The legacy of these deserts remained in the fossil record and the geological formations they left behind. Ancient sandstones, mineral deposits, and eroded rock formations provide clues to scientists about the magnitude and conditions of these deserts, allowing modern researchers to reconstruct the environments in remarkable detail. These deserts also illustrate the interplay between climate, geography, and life. They were both a product of and a force shaping the supercontinent, influencing wind patterns, rainfall distribution, and the movement of animals and plants. The deserts of Pangea were not simply empty spaces. They were dynamic systems where heat, wind, water, and life interacted in complex ways. Over millions of years, small patches of life in these deserts contributed to the spread of plants and animals across Pangea. Seeds carried by wind or animals could germinate in distant regions, connecting isolated populations. Rivers, though temporary, allowed some aquatic species to survive and disperse. The deserts, while harsh, were also a stage for adaptation, evolution, and the gradual shaping of ecosystems that would influence life long after the supercontinent began to fragment. Fossil evidence also indicates occasional extreme events, such as sudden flash floods or brief monsoon-like rains, which would temporarily transform parts of the desert into lush, green areas. These events, though rare, allowed bursts of life to flourish, leaving behind traces in sedimentary layers. Plants could grow quickly, insects could multiply, and animals could exploit these temporary resources before the arid conditions returned. Over long spans of time, these cycles of drought and temporary abundance contributed to the evolution of species with remarkable resilience and flexibility. The deserts of Pangea were harsh teachers, shaping the natural world through relentless heat, shifting sands, and scarce water. Their vastness, intensity, and influence on climate created an environment that tested the limits of life and forced both plants and animals to innovate and adapt. They were a dominant feature of the supercontinent, affecting not only the areas they covered, but also distant regions through climate interactions, and they remain a key focus for understanding the environmental conditions of Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. The study of these deserts continues to provide insight into how life survives in extreme conditions, how landscapes evolve under persistent natural forces, and how ancient climates shape the distribution of ecosystems on a global scale. Fossils of plants, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates from these deserts show patterns of adaptation that echo through time, providing a bridge between past and present life. The seasons during Pangea were not gentle or predictable. Summers burned with a heat so intense that the land itself seemed to smoulder, and the sun appeared to hang in the sky like a relentless, unyielding eye. During these long months, the heat would rise from the surface of the earth, and the air above would shimmer with waves of warmth, making it almost impossible for any living creature to find true comfort. Water sources dried up quickly under this blazing sun. Rivers and lakes, which might have offered even the smallest bit of relief, shrank into narrow, shallow channels or vanished entirely. The ground cracked into jagged patterns, and dust storms could rise without warning, sweeping across the landscape and turning the air thick and almost impossible to breathe. Plants that could survive these conditions were few, and only the hardiest forms of life, including certain insects and small reptiles, could endure the relentless summer heat. As the summer heat finally began to fade, the earth did not gradually cool in a gentle way. Instead, a sharp and sudden transition would occur, plunging temperatures down toward bitter, almost unimaginable lows. Winters arrived with a severity that seemed to catch the world off guard. Frost and ice would cover the ground, freezing rivers that had barely survived the summer. Snow might fall in large, blinding sheets, covering the land in silence, while the winds cut across the barren plains with a sharpness that could chill the bones. Animals that had survived the scorching heat of summer now faced the challenge of finding food under layers of ice and snow. Many creatures would burrow deep into the earth or hibernate in protected areas, waiting for a reprieve that might feel impossibly far away. Trees and other vegetation, already weakened by the summer's extreme conditions, often struggled to survive, and some would die off entirely, leaving the landscape even more stark and bare. Between these extremes, the transitions offered little comfort. Spring and autumn, which in more temperate times might have been seasons of renewal and gentle change, were instead fleeting and unpredictable. One day could bring a sudden warm breeze, only to be followed by a night of harsh frost. The weather seemed to swing without warning, making survival a constant challenge for all life forms. Animals could not rely on the usual cues of the seasons to guide their movements, reproduction, or feeding patterns. Plants, too, could not count on the rhythms of sunlight and rainfall to dictate growth. Seeds might germinate only to be destroyed by an unexpected frost, while young plants could be scorched by a sudden heat wave before they had a chance to take root properly. The chaos of the seasons created enormous pressures on ecosystems. Life had to adapt rapidly or face extinction. Some species developed thick shells or skins to shield themselves from both heat and cold. Others learned to burrow or hide during the most extreme conditions. Water became the most precious commodity, and creatures would often travel long distances to reach dwindling streams or pools that had not yet dried or frozen. Predators, too, were affected, as prey became scarce during the most severe parts of the year. Food chains were fragile, and the balance of life could tip in a single season, wiping out certain species entirely and giving an advantage to others that were better suited to endure the chaos. The land itself was reshaped by these extreme seasonal swings. Erosion from violent summer storms could carve new channels and gullies into the earth, while freezing winters could crack rocks and break apart soil that had been baked hard under the summer sun. The combination of heat, cold, and shifting moisture created a constantly changing landscape, one that rarely offered stable ground or reliable shelter. Mountains, plains, and riverbeds were all affected, their shapes slowly transformed over many cycles of extreme weather. Even the air seemed restless, carrying dust, pollen, and debris in unpredictable ways, sometimes obscuring vision and making navigation dangerous for any creature moving across the terrain. Humans, if they had existed in these times, would have found the seasons nearly impossible to endure without shelter, clothing, and a steady supply of food and water. Crops could not reliably grow from year to year, as frost or heat could destroy them before they matured. Animals for hunting or domestication might not survive long enough to sustain a community. Nomadic patterns would have been driven almost entirely by the survival needs dictated by the unpredictable swings of weather, forcing constant movement in search of more forgiving conditions. Settlements, if any existed, would need to be fortified against both heat and cold, with strategies to store water during droughts and protect food from freezing temperatures. Even geological and atmospheric phenomena were affected by the seasonal chaos. Air currents became turbulent, creating violent storms and unpredictable winds. Thunderstorms could appear with little warning, bringing rain in some areas and leaving nearby regions completely dry. The cycle of freezing and thawing affected the stability of the soil, triggering landslides or mudflows that reshaped the terrain in sudden bursts of destruction. The contrast between the extreme heat of summer and the piercing cold of winter contributed to a world that was alive with constant movement and change, never resting, never calm. Water was particularly central to survival in this volatile climate. Rivers and lakes were inconsistent and sometimes disappeared entirely during the heat of summer, only to be replenished during sudden rainstorms or snowmelt in the winter or spring. This unpredictability forced both plants and animals to develop extraordinary resilience. Some plants evolved deep root systems to reach underground water, while others stored moisture in thick leaves or stems. Animals adapted by storing fat or water in their bodies, migrating great distances, or burrowing deep into the ground to escape the worst conditions. Survival was a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and timing, as the chaotic seasons offered few opportunities for rest or recovery. The effect of the chaotic seasons on the biodiversity of the region was profound. Species that could not adapt quickly enough were driven to extinction, while those with flexible survival strategies proliferated. The constant environmental pressure encouraged evolutionary experimentation, pushing life forms toward remarkable adaptations. Creatures developed protective coverings, efficient methods for conserving energy and water, and behaviors that allowed them to avoid the worst extremes of the seasons. Yet even these adaptations were tested to the limits, as a single unusually harsh summer or unexpected winter could destroy entire populations. Vegetation had to cope with both extremes of temperature and with irregular rainfall. Some hardy trees developed thick bark to resist scorching sun and frost damage alike. Others developed seeds that could lie dormant for years, waiting for a brief window of favourable conditions before germinating. Shrubs and grasses evolved to grow quickly after rare rainfalls, completing their life cycles in weeks rather than months. These adaptations created a patchwork of ecosystems, each uniquely tailored to survive the unpredictable swings of heat and cold, dryness, and occasional moisture. Animals were under even more constant threat, as the seasons dictated not only their survival, but also their reproduction. Some species timed their reproductive cycles to brief periods of warmth or rainfall, while others produced offspring that could survive extreme conditions. Migration became a common survival strategy for many, with herds and flocks moving across vast distances to find areas where the seasonal extremes were less severe. Predators followed these movements, creating dynamic interactions between species that could shift dramatically from one season to the next. Life during this period was a constant struggle, a high-stakes contest between the environment and those who inhabited it. The chaotic seasons also influenced the chemistry and structure of the soil. Extreme heat could dry and harden the surface, making it difficult for roots to penetrate, while sudden freezing and thawing cycles could break up compacted earth and redistribute nutrients in unpredictable ways. Rainfall, when it occurred, often washed away topsoil, leaving barren patches where only the most resilient plants could grow. These soil conditions further reinforced the survival challenges for both flora and fauna, creating a landscape that was ever-changing and rarely forgiving. Over long periods, the seasonal chaos shaped the evolution of life in dramatic ways. The species that survived were those that could respond rapidly to environmental changes, either through behavioural flexibility or physiological adaptations. Over generations, this led to the emergence of highly specialised traits, from heat-resistant skin to cold-tolerant metabolisms. Life became a constant negotiation with the environment, where survival depended not only on strength but also on timing, strategy, and the ability to endure extremes that might seem unthinkable by modern standards. Even the skies reflected the chaotic rhythms of the seasons. Summer brought intense sunlight and, at times, sweltering air currents that could create towering dust storms. Winter skies were often grey and heavy, with clouds that could release sudden snow or sleet. Winds shifted unpredictably, sometimes bringing sudden chill or heat from distant regions. The atmosphere was a restless, ever-changing force, one that influenced every aspect of life below, from the growth of plants to the movement and behaviour of animals. In this world of seasonal chaos, the concept of comfort or stability was almost entirely absent. Life had to be constantly alert and responsive, with survival depending on a combination of adaptation, resilience, and sometimes sheer luck. The land itself bore the marks of this relentless struggle, with eroded landscapes, shifting riverbeds, and a tapestry of ecosystems that were constantly being reshaped by heat, cold, drought, and storms. Ultimately, the scorching summers, freezing winters, and the fragile fleeting periods in between created a world where the very rhythm of life was dictated by extremes. Adaptation was not a choice but a necessity. Survival depended on a delicate balance of preparation and reaction, of resilience and flexibility, in a planet where the seasons themselves seemed to challenge every living creature to endure, to evolve, and to continue in a harsh and unforgiving dance of life. The chaos of the seasons also shaped long-term ecological and evolutionary patterns. Certain areas might become deserts during prolonged heat periods, and then partially recover with the melting of winter snows. Animals and plants developed cycles of growth, dormancy, and reproduction that were closely tied to the extremes of temperature and availability of water. The environment rewarded ingenuity and punished weakness, creating a natural laboratory of survival in which only the adaptable could thrive. Even the smallest organisms were influenced by these fluctuations. Microbial life in soil and water had to cope with both drought and freezing, often surviving by forming protective cysts or spores. Insects timed their life cycles to brief windows of favourable conditions, emerging quickly, reproducing, and disappearing before the next extreme arrived. Life existed in a delicate balance with the rhythm of the seasons, and the planet's ecosystems were in a constant state of tension, driven by the forces of heat and cold, drought and thaw. Over centuries and millennia, the repeated cycles of scorching heat and freezing cold reshaped the planet, leaving permanent marks on the geology, the atmosphere, and the living inhabitants. The chaos of the seasons was not merely a temporary inconvenience, it was a powerful force of nature that shaped life itself, moulding species, landscapes, and ecosystems through the relentless application of environmental pressure. In such a world, survival was the ultimate measure of success, and adaptation was the key to enduring a planet where summers burned and winters froze, and where little relief existed between the extremes. The seasonal chaos forged a world of dramatic contrasts. Rivers could be brimming with water one season and reduced to dry beds the next. Valleys could be lush with brief vegetation after a rare rain, then stripped bare by sun and wind. Animals developed incredible endurance and resilience, moving tirelessly across vast landscapes in search of sustenance and safety. The constant pressure of survival under extreme seasonal swings accelerated evolutionary change, giving rise to remarkable diversity in form and function, even in the harshest environments. This world, ruled by the extremes of heat and cold, gave life no pause, offering no predictable patterns and rewarding only those creatures that could endure the most intense and unpredictable conditions. The scorching summers and freezing winters were not simply weather. They were forces that shaped every aspect of life, from the smallest microorganism to the largest predator, from the shallowest pond to the highest mountain, creating a planet where the chaos of the seasons defined existence itself. The relentless interplay between burning summers and icy winters left a lasting imprint on the planet, shaping both its surface and the life that inhabited it. Ecosystems were in constant flux, with species adapting, migrating, or perishing in response to the extremes. The land bore the scars of heat, cold, drought, and snow, a testimony to the power of the chaotic seasons and the endurance of life that managed to survive in their grip. Each year brought a new test, each season a new challenge, and through this cycle of extremes, the world of seasonal chaos continued, fierce, unpredictable, and unforgiving, shaping life in ways that would echo through countless generations. The Earth during the time of the late Permian period, roughly around 252 million years ago, was a world in turmoil, a place of both immense beauty and terrifying destruction. Among the most violent and terrifying forces shaping this ancient world were the volcanoes, not the small, gentle eruptions that one might see today, but enormous roaring giants that spewed molten rock and deadly gases into the sky in quantities that defy modern understanding. These eruptions were not isolated or brief. They were monumental, stretching over hundreds of thousands of years in some regions, and their effects could be felt across entire continents. The skies above these lands were often choked with thick clouds of smoke, ash, and toxic gases, turning day into a dim, ominous twilight and transforming the very air that living creatures depended upon into a deadly, suffocating miasma. The volcanic activity during this time was especially concentrated in areas that are today known as Siberia, where immense flood basalt eruptions occurred, forming what geologists call the Siberian traps. These eruptions poured out vast quantities of molten lava that spread over millions of square kilometers, creating layers upon layers of solidified rock, sometimes more than 3 kilometers thick. The sheer scale of these eruptions was staggering. Lava flows moved like slow rivers of fire, consuming forests, swamps, and everything in their path. Trees and plants were incinerated in moments, and the animals that had no means of escape were trapped and turned to ash or scorched remains. Yet it was not just the lava that made these volcanic events so deadly. The gases released into the atmosphere were far more insidious, invisible killers that spread across the globe. Volcanoes release many types of gases, but during the massive eruptions of the late Permian, the air became filled with carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and other toxic compounds. Carbon dioxide, while naturally present in the atmosphere, was suddenly released in enormous amounts, trapping heat and driving global temperatures higher. Sulfur dioxide combined with moisture in the air to form acid rain, which fell in heavy sheets, burning skin, corroding leaves, and dissolving the protective coverings of ancient soils. The methane released added to the warming, creating a greenhouse effect so intense that it likely caused the oceans to heat to deadly temperatures. Many marine creatures, from tiny plankton to massive fish, could not survive these extreme conditions. The waters became poisonous and stratified, with layers of oxygen-rich water on top and oxygen-poor, suffocating water beneath. The skies above these volcanic regions were a chaotic mixture of smoke, ash, and poisonous gases. During the height of an eruption, the sun would often be obscured by thick clouds of ash, creating an eerie, dim light that lasted for days or even weeks. Daylight was muted to a dull, reddish glow, and temperatures could swing wildly between scorching heat during the day and freezing cold at night as the sun's warmth was blocked from reaching the surface. Rainfall, if it occurred at all, was often highly acidic, scouring the landscape and killing plants that had survived the initial lava flows. Wind carried clouds of ash thousands of kilometers away, dropping fine particles that suffocated animals and humans alike, coated vegetation in a suffocating layer of dust, and disrupted photosynthesis, leading to widespread starvation among herbivores. The eruptions also had profound effects on the oceans. As volcanic gases entered the atmosphere and reacted with water, they led to acidification, which made it extremely difficult for creatures with shells or skeletons made of calcium carbonate to survive. Coral-like organisms, ammonites, brachiopods, and many plankton species struggled to form protective shells, weakening entire food chains. The oceans, once teeming with life, became hostile environments, and marine extinctions soared. At the same time, massive amounts of methane from seabed clathrates may have been released as ocean temperatures rose, adding fuel to the greenhouse effect and driving global warming to levels unprecedented in Earth's history up to that point. The land was not spared either. Forests were burned, rivers were contaminated with volcanic debris and acidic runoff, and the soils that had once supported a rich variety of plants became inhospitable wastelands. The combination of heat, toxic gases, and acid rain led to massive die-offs of both plants and animals. Reptiles, amphibians, and early mammal-like creatures struggled to find shelter and food. Even small insects and invertebrates, which are often more resilient to environmental changes, faced dramatic reductions in numbers. The once vibrant landscapes became barren, lifeless stretches, dotted with the skeletal remains of creatures that had once roamed freely. The atmosphere itself was transformed. Clouds of ash and gas could linger for months, and in some cases years, reducing the amount of sunlight that reached the Earth's surface. This volcanic winter effect caused temperatures to plummet in certain regions, creating a dangerous combination of global warming and local cooling. The paradox of simultaneous heat and cold created a climate that was extremely unstable and unpredictable. Seasonal patterns were disrupted, rainfall became irregular, and storms of unprecedented ferocity swept across the continents. The very air that living beings relied upon became a vehicle for poison, carrying both heat-trapping gases and suffocating ash. Breathing itself became an ordeal, and many creatures perished simply because they could not intake clean, oxygen-rich air. Some of the deadliest gases released included hydrogen sulfide, which is highly toxic and can cause respiratory failure even in very small concentrations. When released in large quantities from volcanic eruptions, it would have poisoned both land and sea. In the oceans, hydrogen sulfide could lead to massive fish kills and the death of other marine life. In the atmosphere, it would have contributed to a layer of toxic haze, further reducing the amount of sunlight and exacerbating the stress on both plants and animals. The combined effects of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide created an almost uninhabitable environment across much of the planet. The consequences of these massive eruptions were long-lasting. The Siberian Traps, for instance, erupted over a period of roughly 1 million years, releasing continuous plumes of lava and gases. This was not a brief episode, but an extended period of environmental catastrophe that reshaped the world. Entire species disappeared, ecosystems collapsed, and the very fabric of life was altered. Fossil evidence shows that up to 96% of marine species and about 70% of terrestrial vertebrates vanished during this period, making it the most severe mass extinction event in Earth's history. Plants that once thrived in vast forests gave way to hardier, more drought-resistant species, and the survivors were forced to adapt to a planet that had become far more hostile than ever before. Volcanic eruptions also triggered secondary disasters. The intense heat from lava flows could ignite massive wildfires, which spread across continents, consuming forests and releasing additional carbon dioxide into the already overloaded atmosphere. The combination of fires, ash clouds and toxic gases created a feedback loop of destruction, making recovery slow and difficult. Rivers and lakes filled with volcanic debris and acidic water became unfit for most life, while soils lost their fertility, preventing new plant growth for decades or centuries. The long-term consequences of these eruptions were felt for millions of years, shaping the evolution of life and the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. The toxic skies of the late Permian were not just a scientific curiosity, they were an existential threat to all life. The air, once a source of life, became a lethal mix of poisons. The Earth's protective layers were compromised, and the delicate balance of ecosystems collapsed. Creatures that had survived previous climate changes found themselves unable to cope with the combined effects of heat, acid rain, and toxic gases. The planet was a furnace of fire and a cauldron of poison, and only the most adaptable life forms managed to endure. Evidence from modern geology and paleontology allows scientists to reconstruct this terrifying period with remarkable detail. Layers of volcanic rock, ash deposits, and chemical signatures in ancient sediments tell the story of a world in chaos. Fossilized remains of plants and animals provide snapshots of suffering and survival, showing which species could withstand the heat and the poisons and which vanished forever. The Siberian traps, still visible today, are a testament to the scale and power of these eruptions, a reminder that the Earth is capable of unleashing forces far beyond human comprehension. The interplay between volcanic eruptions and the atmosphere also illustrates the complex relationship between geological activity and climate. Volcanic gases altered the composition of the atmosphere, which in turn affected temperatures, weather patterns, and ocean chemistry. This dynamic interplay created a cascade of environmental stresses, demonstrating how interconnected life and the Earth itself are. The deadly clouds that once hung over the planet were not just a product of fire and lava, but of chemistry, physics, and the movement of Earth's tectonic plates. The release of gases during eruptions was amplified by the sheer scale and frequency of the events, leading to prolonged periods of atmospheric toxicity that no single species could escape. The extinction event associated with these volcanic eruptions also serves as a reminder of the fragility of life. Even the largest and most dominant species were not immune. Reptiles that had ruled the land, massive amphibians and early synapsids all faced dramatic population declines. Many invertebrates, from trilobites to insects, experienced severe reductions or complete local extinction. Plant life too suffered, with many ancient forests replaced by scrubby vegetation that could survive in harsher conditions. Recovery was slow and uncertain, with ecosystems taking millions of years to regain complexity and diversity. In many ways, the late Permian volcanism shows the power of Earth's natural systems to transform life on a global scale. Lava and gases, released over vast areas and long periods, created an environmental crisis unlike any other. Toxic skies and burning landscapes reshaped continents, altered oceans, and forced life to adapt in dramatic ways. The legacy of these eruptions can be seen not only in the fossil record, but also in the very geology of the planet, a permanent reminder of the potential for destruction inherent in volcanic activity. The story of volcanoes and poisonous skies during the late Permian is a story of extremes: extreme heat, extreme toxicity, and extreme destruction. It was a time when the air itself could kill, when the land burned and the seas boiled, when life was pushed to the edge of survival. It is a story that underscores the intimate connection between Earth's geological forces and the life that inhabits it. By studying these ancient eruptions, scientists gain insight not only into the history of our planet, but also into the delicate balance that allows life to flourish. The events of 252 million years ago serve as both a warning and a lesson, showing that even the mightiest species must bow to the power of fire, gas, and poison in the atmosphere. The volcanic eruptions of the Siberian traps and elsewhere were monumental events that reshaped the Earth. Lava flows covered vast regions, ash clouds blocked the sun, toxic gases filled the air, oceans became acidic and suffocating, and life was forced into a struggle for survival on an unprecedented scale. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting, altering the course of evolution and leaving a mark on the planet that can still be studied today. The poisonous skies of the late Permian were a deadly cloak over the Earth. a reminder of the raw, unrelenting power of volcanoes and the fragility of life in the face of such forces. The full extent of the destruction caused by these eruptions is difficult to comprehend. Entire ecosystems disappeared, leaving behind blank landscapes punctuated only by the skeletal remains of once thriving life. Oceans that had been rich in biodiversity were reduced to hostile environments. Forests that had provided shelter, food, and oxygen were reduced to charred remnants. The air, laced with carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, was a deadly cocktail that few species could endure. Life that survived had to adapt to new extremes, evolve rapidly, or face extinction. Even today, the Siberian traps and other ancient volcanic deposits serve as geological records, preserving the story of a world reshaped by fire and poison. Layers of basalt, ash, and chemical traces in sediment reveal the intensity, duration, and impact of these eruptions. Fossils embedded within these layers tell tales of death, survival, and the slow, painstaking recovery of life. The late Permian eruptions, massive and sustained, were not simply geological events. They were agents of transformation, forces that reshaped the planet on every level: atmosphere, land, and sea. The poisonous skies of the late Permian, filled with volcanic gases and ash, stand as a testament to the raw power of the Earth. They remind us that life on this planet has always been subject to forces far beyond its control, forces capable of altering the course of evolution and reshaping the environment on a global scale. The lessons from this period are embedded in the rocks, the fossils, and the very air we breathe today, offering a window into a time when the world was enveloped by fire, smoke, and deadly gases, and when survival depended on adaptability, resilience, and the sheer will to endure. The era of volcanic chaos during the late Permian demonstrates how the combination of heat, toxic gases, acid rain, and lava flows created an environment that was nearly uninhabitable. It is a story of devastation, resilience, and transformation, illustrating how Earth's most violent forces can create both destruction and the conditions for new forms of life to eventually emerge. Life was forced to confront the most extreme challenges imaginable, navigating a world where the skies themselves were filled with poison, where the land was a furnace, and where the seas had turned against those who depended upon them. The echoes of these eruptions continue to resonate through geological time, providing a powerful lesson in the potential for nature to wield absolute and overwhelming power. The skies of the late Permian, thick with volcanic ash and toxic gases, were more than just a dramatic backdrop to the end Permian extinctions. They were active participants in the global environmental crisis. By altering temperatures, blocking sunlight, acidifying rain, and suffocating life, these volcanic eruptions reshaped the biosphere and left an indelible mark on the history of our planet. They remind us that the Earth's natural forces, while sometimes silent and slow-moving, can erupt with a fury capable of reshaping the destiny of life itself. The story of these massive eruptions, the poisonous skies, and their deadly impact continues to captivate scientists and historians of the Earth alike. They illustrate the interplay of fire, gas, water, and life, showing how each element could amplify the effects of the others in a catastrophic chain reaction. 252 million years ago, the Earth experienced one of its most extreme periods of volcanic activity, a time when volcanoes not only reshaped the land, but turned the atmosphere into a deadly hazard. The consequences were profound, extending beyond the immediate destruction to influence climate, ecosystems, and the very path of evolution for millions of years to come. The deadly combination of molten lava, acid rain, and poisonous gases transformed the Earth into a planet on the edge of ruin. Survival became a matter of adaptability and luck, and only those species capable of enduring the extreme conditions persisted. The story of volcanoes and poisonous skies in the late Permian is a stark reminder of the power of Earth's natural forces, a vivid illustration of how fire and gas can reshape a planet and challenge every form of life that calls it home. The late Permian volcanic eruptions were, in essence, global-scale experiments in environmental destruction. Their sheer magnitude, duration, and intensity created conditions that would have been unimaginable to the creatures of that time. The Earth was a furnace of molten rock, a cauldron of acidic water, and an atmosphere thick with poison, all unfolding over a period of millions of years. Life struggled to survive, ecosystems collapsed, and only the most adaptable managed to endure the lethal combination of heat, gas, and fire. The volcanic activity that led to poisonous skies was not only a local disaster, but a planetary one. The gases released spread across the globe, affecting climates thousands of kilometers away from the eruption sites. Oceans became suffocating, lands were scorched, and the air itself became a weapon of destruction. By studying the evidence left behind in rocks, fossils, and chemical traces, scientists can reconstruct the terrifying reality of life under these deadly skies and understand the profound impact that volcanic activity can have on the entire planet. The Siberian traps, with their enormous lava flows and continuous eruptions, exemplify the scale of this catastrophe. Over millions of years, these eruptions released more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases than had been emitted in any previous known period. The atmosphere became a lethal soup of heat-trapping gases and toxins, and the combined effects of global warming, acid rain, and toxic air created an environment in which survival was the exception rather than the rule. The world was engulfed in fire, ash, and gas, and life was pushed to the brink of extinction. Volcanoes and poisonous skies of the late Permian are a sobering reminder of the destructive potential of our planet. They demonstrate that even in times when life seemed abundant and thriving, the forces of nature could unleash events that would drastically alter the course of evolution. Lava, ash, and toxic gases, released over vast areas and extended periods, transformed the Earth into a place of deadly beauty, where survival required extraordinary resilience and adaptability. Fossils, rock layers, and chemical traces continue to tell this story today, offering a glimpse into one of the most dramatic and destructive chapters in the history of life on Earth. The late Permian volcanic eruptions left a legacy that is still evident in the geological record. The landscapes we see today, the layers of basalt and ash, and the traces of toxic gases preserved in sediments all speak of a time when volcanoes reshaped the planet and poisoned the skies. These events were not just destructive, they were transformative, altering climates, oceans, and ecosystems in ways that would reverberate for millions of years. The story of these eruptions and of the poisonous skies they created reminds us of the incredible power of natural forces and the fragile resilience of life in the face of such overwhelming danger. The massive eruptions of the late Permian, which filled the skies with volcanic ash and deadly gases, represent one of the most extreme periods in Earth's history. Lava flowed over millions of square kilometers, ash blocked sunlight for months, oceans became acidic, and the air itself turned poisonous. The consequences were catastrophic, wiping out most marine species and many terrestrial creatures. Life that survived had to endure heat, toxic air, acid rain, and a constantly changing environment. The Earth's atmosphere was transformed, the land was scarred, and the oceans were poisoned. The Siberian traps remain one of the most striking reminders of this period. They are a record of the power and persistence of volcanic activity, a monument to the ability of a molten rock and toxic gases to reshape the world on a planetary scale. The eruptions that created the traps released unimaginable quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, creating poisonous skies that made survival a constant struggle. 252 million years ago, the Earth was a place where fire and gas dominated the landscape, where ash darkened the skies, and where life faced one of its most severe tests. The world of Pangea was a place of extremes, and nowhere were these extremes more deadly than in the very air that creatures breathed. The atmosphere at that time was a cruel, unrelenting force, filled with a deadly combination of gases that made survival a constant struggle. The levels of carbon dioxide were far higher than anything seen in modern times, while oxygen, the very element that all animals and many plants needed to live, was dangerously low. Life on land and in water was forced to cope with an air that could suffocate as easily as it could sustain, and every breath carried the weight of peril. The carbon dioxide levels during the late Permian period, when Pangea was at its height, were astonishingly high, reaching amounts perhaps 10 times greater than present-day concentrations. This carbon dioxide did not just linger harmlessly in the atmosphere, it had profound consequences for every living being. It created a blanket over the planet that trapped heat, intensifying temperatures to extreme levels and altering the climate in ways that made survival difficult. These high levels of carbon dioxide contributed to a greenhouse effect so powerful that it baked the land during the day, leaving it scorching under the sun and reducing the already limited rainfall to even lower levels. This made rivers shrink and lakes evaporate, leaving behind cracked earth and lifeless salt flats that could reflect the blinding light of the sun back at any creature bold enough to cross them. At the same time, oxygen, the element that animals relied upon for energy and survival, was alarmingly low. In some regions, it may have fallen to less than 15% of the atmosphere, compared to the 21% found today. For many animals, this was enough to make the air feel like thick syrup, difficult to inhale and far too thin to sustain activity. Predators that required high levels of oxygen to chase their prey were slowed and weakened. Smaller creatures, more vulnerable to environmental stress, struggled to move or even breathe. Plants, though less dependent on oxygen, also suffered as the chemical balance of the air disrupted their respiration and growth. Trees and ferns found it difficult to grow tall or produce abundant leaves, while ancient seed plants faced challenges in reproducing effectively, leading to weaker populations over time. The combination of suffocating carbon dioxide and scarce oxygen created what could be called an atmosphere of strangulation. Creatures that had evolved over millions of years to adapt to previous conditions suddenly found themselves in an environment that defied their capabilities. Amphibians, reptiles, and early mammal-like reptiles, therapsids, had to contend with air that could cause rapid exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Their lungs struggled to extract enough oxygen, and their hearts had to work overtime to circulate what little energy they could gain from each breath. Aquatic life was no less affected. Oceans absorbed a significant portion of the excess carbon dioxide, creating waters that were more acidic than usual. This acidification disrupted the delicate chemical balance needed for shell-forming organisms like brachiopods and mollusks, whose shells weakened and often dissolved in the water, leaving them exposed to predators and environmental stress. Fish and other marine vertebrates had to adapt to oxygen-poor waters that made swimming and hunting more laborious, while the tiniest plankton, the foundation of the marine food chain, struggled to survive in waters increasingly inhospitable to life. As if the chemical composition of the air were not enough, the geography of Pangea itself worsened the problem. The supercontinent was massive, stretching from the northern polar regions to the southern extremes, and its interior regions were far removed from the moderating influence of oceans. This meant that carbon dioxide accumulated more readily in the central deserts and plains, and the already low oxygen levels were even more pronounced far from the coasts. Creatures living in the heart of Pangea were forced to endure the worst of these conditions, often experiencing sudden and severe bouts of suffocation, particularly in low-lying areas where gases could settle. Valleys, basins, and depressions may have acted like natural traps for carbon dioxide, forming invisible pools of deadly air that could kill in hours or even minutes. During volcanic eruptions, these effects were magnified, as clouds of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other toxic gases surged from the Earth and filled the surrounding atmosphere, leaving animals no means of escape. Volcanoes, which were active during this period, contributed enormously to the suffocating atmosphere. Massive eruptions from giant volcanic provinces released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and other noxious gases in a short span of time. When these eruptions occurred, the local atmosphere could shift from bad to lethal almost instantly. Animals and plants caught downwind were often overwhelmed, unable to escape the thick, choking clouds that descended upon them. Over longer periods, repeated eruptions added to the global carbon dioxide levels, creating an enduring greenhouse effect that slowly but relentlessly raised temperatures and lowered oxygen concentrations. Even creatures that had survived a volcanic event could not count on safety, because the atmosphere was continuously being poisoned over millennia, with no chance for recovery before the next catastrophe. The effects of this deadly air extended beyond immediate suffocation. High carbon dioxide levels and low oxygen caused profound physiological stress. Animals developed slower metabolisms in response to the lack of oxygen, making it harder for them to grow, reproduce, or escape predators. Young animals, often more sensitive to environmental extremes, had particularly low survival rates. Fossil evidence shows that many species went extinct rapidly, while others evolved smaller sizes or specific adaptations to cope with the thin air. Plants showed stunted growth, with fewer leaves and reduced reproduction, affecting the herbivores that depended on them and creating a cascading effect through the ecosystem. The suffocating atmosphere thus reshaped life in every corner of Pangea, selecting for only the hardiest, most resilient species. Even the oceans were not spared from the suffocating reach of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater to form carbonic acid, lowering the pH of the oceans and creating what scientists call ocean acidification. This had devastating effects on coral-like organisms and shelled invertebrates, whose calcium carbonate shells struggled to form or began to dissolve. Marine ecosystems were disrupted, reducing food availability for larger creatures and creating starvation pressures that further compounded the lethal effects of the atmosphere. Low oxygen levels in the oceans, sometimes reaching near anoxic conditions, made survival nearly impossible for many fish and invertebrates. Dead zones formed in shallow seas and coastal areas, where decaying organisms released more carbon dioxide and depleted the water of oxygen even further, creating a feedback loop of suffocation that could last for centuries. The extreme air composition also had indirect consequences on weather patterns. With carbon dioxide trapping so much heat, Pangea experienced scorching summers in the interior deserts and milder, though still harsh, winters near the coasts. The low oxygen levels affected not just animals but also the growth of forests, which normally would have helped regulate climate by releasing oxygen and absorbing carbon dioxide. Without adequate forests, the land became drier, more prone to fires, and less capable of moderating the temperature extremes. Wildfires would have been common, and these too contributed to the atmospheric poisoning, releasing even more carbon dioxide and particulates into the already hazardous air. Creatures that managed to survive these conditions often did so by finding refuge in pockets where oxygen was slightly higher or carbon dioxide slightly lower. These refuges might have included coastal regions, highlands, or areas near freshwater rivers and lakes, where atmospheric mixing could dilute the deadly gases. However, these safe havens were limited in number and size, meaning that overcrowding, competition for food, and the spread of disease were additional challenges for survival. Even the fittest animals faced constant pressure, and many species adapted with smaller body sizes, slower activity, or specialized behaviors to cope with the harsh air. Some may have become nocturnal to avoid the daytime heat, while others might have burrowed underground where oxygen levels were marginally higher and carbon dioxide was less concentrated. Plants too adapted in subtle ways, with some developing thicker leaves to conserve moisture and reduce gas exchange, while others evolved reproductive strategies that minimized exposure to the toxic atmosphere. The suffocating conditions of Pangea ultimately contributed to one of the most catastrophic extinction events in Earth's history. Known as the Great Dying, this event saw the disappearance of nearly 90% of marine species and more than 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. Scientists believe that the combination of high carbon dioxide, low oxygen, extreme heat, and ocean acidification created a perfect storm that life could not withstand. Organisms that had survived earlier periods of environmental stress suddenly found themselves unable to cope with the sheer scale and intensity of atmospheric changes. Ecosystems collapsed, leaving barren landscapes and lifeless seas in their wake. Fossil records from this time show widespread evidence of dying animals, discolored soils, and layers of ash and sediment consistent with volcanic eruptions and environmental collapse. The time of Pangea was not only a period of great land masses coming together, but also a time when the oceans, which should have been full of life, became almost unrecognizable and profoundly hostile to most forms of marine life. The seas that surrounded this massive supercontinent were no longer the vibrant blue expanses teeming with fish, corals, and countless other marine creatures as we know today. Instead, they had transformed into stagnant, oxygen-starved waters where life found it nearly impossible to survive. These oceans were places of slow death, where the usual rhythms of tides, currents, and nutrient flows had been thrown into chaos by the enormous and unprecedented size of the continents, as well as the extreme climates that dominated the planet during this period. The oceans of Pangea were largely cut off from the constant mixing that normally refreshes the waters. In modern seas, waves and tides, combined with wind and temperature differences, help to circulate oxygen and nutrients throughout the water, ensuring that marine ecosystems can thrive. But during Pangea, the vastness of the landmasses disrupted these natural patterns. Many of the seas that bordered the supercontinent became trapped basins, shallow and almost enclosed, where water circulation was minimal. Without this circulation, oxygen from the air could not penetrate deeply, and the deeper layers of water became suffocatingly low in oxygen. In these conditions, only a few specially adapted organisms could survive, and even they faced extreme challenges. The very chemistry of the seas changed in response to these conditions. As oxygen levels dropped, the water became rich in compounds like hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas that smells faintly of rotten eggs. This compound is deadly to most life, yet in some places it accumulated in enormous quantities, turning entire stretches of ocean into zones where animals could not breathe. Fish that strayed into these waters would quickly suffocate. Creatures like trilobites, ammonites, and early forms of marine reptiles faced increasing threats as the chemical balance of their environment deteriorated. Coral reefs, which require not just oxygen but also stable conditions and sunlight, often collapsed or disappeared entirely from the regions affected. The once colourful and lively underwater landscapes became barren expanses of murky, dangerous water. Temperature also played a critical role in making Pangean seas so deadly. The extreme seasonal swings on land extended their influence into the oceans. Summers were blisteringly hot, heating shallow waters to levels that many marine species could not tolerate, while winters, although cold, did little to alleviate the stagnation of water in these shallow basins. Warmer water holds less oxygen than cooler water, so during the scorching seasons, oxygen levels would plummet even further. This meant that marine life faced not only chemical toxicity, but also suffocation caused simply by the lack of breathable oxygen. In some regions, shallow seas would turn into what scientists now call dead zones, large areas in which almost no life could survive. The size and duration of these dead zones during Pangea were likely far greater than anything seen on Earth today. Beyond the chemical and thermal stress, marine life was also challenged by changes in the nutrient cycle. Normally, upwelling currents bring nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface, feeding plankton, which in turn feeds larger creatures like fish and marine reptiles. But in stagnant, oxygen-poor waters, these currents weakened or stopped altogether. Nutrients accumulated in the lower layers, where oxygen was absent, leading to the growth of bacteria that could survive in such harsh conditions. Some of these bacteria produced additional toxic gases, further poisoning the seas. At the same time, the surface layers became depleted of essential nutrients, making it harder for plankton to grow. Without plankton thriving, the entire food web began to collapse. Fish and other predators found it increasingly difficult to find food, leading to starvation on top of suffocation. The geography of Pangea further worsened the situation. With the supercontinent stretching from near the North Pole to the South Pole, the oceans were divided into long, narrow seaways and shallow epicontinental seas. These configurations limited the exchange of water with the wider ocean, creating pockets where oxygen levels could drop dramatically. Shallow seas would heat up quickly under the intense summer sun, accelerating the consumption of whatever oxygen remained. In some areas, large regions of water became stratified, with the upper layers warmer and slightly more oxygenated, while the lower layers sank into darkness, becoming cold, heavy, and completely devoid of a life-sustaining oxygen. Any creature that descended too far or was forced into these depths could not survive for long. Fossil evidence supports the picture of these deadly oceans. Rocks from the late Permian period, roughly around 252 million years ago, contain layers rich in chemical markers that indicate low oxygen and high levels of hydrogen sulfide. Fossils of marine animals from these layers often show signs of stress or sudden death, suggesting that the seas could turn deadly with little warning. Entire species disappeared during these times, and those that survived were often small, hardy, and able to withstand the most extreme conditions. This period also coincides with the most catastrophic mass extinction in Earth's history, sometimes called the Great Dying, which affected not only land animals but almost all marine life. Scientists believe that the toxic, oxygen-starved seas played a central role in this event, slowly suffocating life and destabilizing ecosystems over thousands of years. Even creatures that were normally adaptable were not immune. Early sharks, for instance, which had survived multiple environmental changes in the past, found themselves trapped in pockets of oxygen-poor water. Many species of bony fish could not tolerate the low oxygen and high hydrogen sulfide, leading to massive die-offs. Invertebrates such as brachiopods, mollusks, and ammonoids faced similar pressures. Some were able to retreat into slightly deeper waters or migrate to more hospitable regions. But as the extent of these oxygen-depleted zones grew, safe havens became scarce. Coral-like organisms suffered as well, unable to maintain the delicate balance required to build their skeletal structures without adequate oxygen and nutrients. The deadly oceans were not only vast in size but persistent over time. Unlike short-lived ecological disasters that last a few years or decades, the oxygen-starved seas of Pangea were stable enough to influence evolutionary trajectories for millions of years. Species that survived were forced to evolve new strategies, including adaptations for low oxygen tolerance, burrowing into sediments, or feeding on bacteria that could thrive in toxic conditions. The marine food web became truncated, dominated by fewer species that could endure extreme conditions, while the once diverse ecosystems of coral reefs, kelp forests, and open ocean communities collapsed. This long-lasting pressure shaped the evolution of marine life for millions of years, setting the stage for the oceans we know today after countless cycles of recovery and extinction. Geological events also contributed to the decline of oxygen in the seas. Massive volcanic eruptions during the late Permian released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, which warmed the climate and altered weather patterns. Higher temperatures on land and sea increased the rate of organic decay in rivers and estuaries, which in turn delivered vast amounts of decomposing material into the oceans. As bacteria consumed this material, oxygen levels in the water dropped further, creating a feedback loop that amplified the deadliness of the seas. At the same time, changes in sea level caused by tectonic activity would flood shallow continental shelves, mixing nutrient-rich but oxygen-poor waters into areas that had previously been hospitable. This constant interplay of geological and chemical forces kept the oceans in a precarious state, where life was constantly on the edge. Evidence from modern analogues also helps to understand these ancient oceans. Today we see oxygen-depleted zones, sometimes called hypoxic or anoxic regions, in areas such as the Baltic Sea or the Gulf of Mexico. In these zones, fish die en masse, plants decay, and bacteria dominate. The oceans of Pangea, however, were on a much larger and more intense scale. Entire seaways spanning thousands of kilometers were likely affected, and these conditions persisted for millions of years, making survival a constant struggle. Marine life had to contend not only with immediate threats, but also with a long-term lack of oxygen that would shape the evolution, distribution, and behavior of species for generations. Even as some regions of the ocean remained relatively oxygenated, they became ecological islands. Species that could survive in slightly better conditions were often confined to small patches, isolated from others of their kind. This led to genetic bottlenecks, where populations were reduced in size and diversity, making them even more vulnerable to environmental changes. Predators and prey alike faced the same challenges. With limited space, competition for food intensified, while oxygen stress continued to take a toll on weaker individuals. Over time, these pressures favoured hardy, opportunistic species, while many specialised and delicate forms vanished entirely. The story of the oceans during Pangea is thus a tale of struggle, adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds. These waters were not merely inhospitable, they were active agents in shaping life on Earth. Marine organisms were forced to evolve in ways that allowed them to withstand suffocating conditions, while entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed in response to chemical, thermal, and geological pressures. The oceans became a crucible of life, where only the strongest, most adaptable, or luckiest species could endure. The fossil record, geological evidence, and modern analogues together paint a vivid picture of these deadly seas, revealing the immense challenges faced by life during one of the most extreme periods in Earth's history. Life in Pangea's oceans was a constant battle for survival. Fish, invertebrates, and marine reptiles navigated waters where oxygen was scarce, toxins were abundant, and temperatures fluctuated unpredictably. Only those organisms that could withstand multiple stresses at once had a chance to survive. Over millions of years, these pressures led to evolutionary innovations, new ecological strategies, and the extinction of countless species that could not cope. The oceans of Pangea, once a cradle for life, had become a vast and deadly expanse, demonstrating how the environment can profoundly shape the course of evolution. Even after the end of the late Permian, the scars of these oxygen-starved seas remained. Subsequent generations of marine species had to contend with lingering low oxygen pockets, altered ocean currents, and the slow recovery of ecosystems. The legacy of Pangea's deadly oceans can still be traced in the evolutionary lineage of modern marine life, in the patterns of extinction and survival, and in the geological layers that preserve the chemical fingerprints of an era when the seas themselves became an unforgiving force, a place where life teetered on the brink of suffocation. The vast, stagnant and oxygen-poor oceans of Pangea were more than a background setting. They were a defining element of the planet's history, shaping life in ways that continue to echo millions of years later. The intensity and scale of these conditions cannot be overstated. Where modern humans might find a few hundred square kilometers of hypoxic water concerning, Pangea experienced entire ocean basins that were dead for thousands, if not millions of years. These zones could stretch over thousands of kilometers, covering wide continental shelves and shallow inland seas. The result was not just localized suffering, but a planetary-scale ecological crisis, a vast and enduring theatre of chemical suffocation where marine life was tested to its absolute limits. The struggle for survival in such seas demonstrates the incredible resilience and fragility of life, showing how even the largest and most enduring ecosystems are vulnerable to shifts in oxygen, temperature, and chemical balance. The world of Pangea, which existed around 300 million years ago, was a land of extremes, a massive supercontinent where life had to adapt to conditions unlike anything seen on Earth today. Among the most fascinating and fearsome creatures to roam these lands were the giant reptiles, magnificent beings whose lives and fortunes seemed tied closely to the changing environment, the shifting climate, and the relentless cycles of survival and extinction. The rise and fall of these enormous reptiles tell a story of evolution, struggle, and disappearance that shaped the course of life on Earth in profound ways. In the earliest days of their emergence, reptiles had begun to take advantage of opportunities that the planet presented. Their ancestors, small and often fragile, had learned to survive on land, developing scales, efficient lungs, and the ability to lay eggs in dry environments. These adaptations allowed them to spread across vast regions of Pangea, moving into areas that were becoming too harsh for amphibians and other waterbound creatures. The earliest of these reptiles were not always the giants they would later become, but they represented a turning point in evolution, a moment when life began to leave the water behind and truly conquer the land. Some of the first reptiles were nimble and small, capable of hiding from predators, yet their descendants would grow into towering beasts with thick, scaly skin, long tails and sharp teeth designed for hunting or scavenging. During the height of their existence, giant reptiles were found in many regions of Pangea, thriving particularly in areas where resources were abundant. In the equatorial regions, where rainfall was higher and vegetation flourished, enormous reptiles could find enough food to sustain their massive bodies. These included early ancestors of crocodiles and lizard-like creatures that sometimes measured several meters in length. Their diets varied widely. Some were carnivorous, preying on smaller animals or even their own kind, while others were herbivorous, grazing on ferns, conifers, and other prehistoric plants. The diversity of these reptiles was staggering. In some areas, reptiles dominated the landscape, becoming the top predators and ruling over forests, rivers, and even the newly forming deserts. They were not only physically imposing, but also remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving periods of drought, fluctuating temperatures, and seasonal changes in food availability. Yet, the fortunes of these giant reptiles were far from uniform across Pangea. While some regions became havens for their growth, others proved perilous and unforgiving. In the drier interiors of the supercontinent, where deserts expanded and water sources were scarce, many reptiles struggled to survive. Here, only the hardiest species could endure, and even they faced constant threats from predators, competition for food, and environmental stress. Reptiles in these harsher regions often exhibited remarkable adaptations. Some developed elongated limbs to travel long distances in search of water. Others evolved thicker scales to conserve moisture, and some even changed their behaviours, becoming nocturnal to escape the scorching heat of the day. Despite these adaptations, many species eventually disappeared from these regions, unable to cope with the relentless environmental pressures. In contrast, the coastal and riverine areas of Pangea were more forgiving. These regions, with their abundant water, fertile soil, and relatively stable climate, allowed reptiles to flourish. Swamps, lakes, and river valleys provided both food and shelter, and reptiles in these areas often grew to enormous sizes. Some species developed long necks to reach high vegetation, while others evolved powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. In these ecosystems, reptiles became key players, influencing the behavior and evolution of other animals around them. They were apex predators, dominant herbivores, and sometimes even scavengers, shaping the structure of their habitats through their presence and activities. Fossil evidence from these regions suggests that these reptiles were not just survivors, but rulers of their worlds, living in complex social structures, competing fiercely for mates and territory, and interacting with countless other species in a delicate ecological balance. The rise of giant reptiles was not a steady or guaranteed process. Their expansion and success were closely tied to climatic fluctuations, geological events, and even catastrophic disasters. Volcanic eruptions, shifting rivers, and the gradual drying of certain regions could decimate populations, forcing reptiles to migrate, adapt, or perish. The fossil record shows periods of rapid growth and diversification, followed by sudden declines when conditions changed too quickly for species to adjust. These cycles of rise and fall were a constant feature of life during Pangea, reflecting the precarious balance between adaptation and extinction. In some instances, entire lineages vanished within a few thousand years, leaving only traces in the fossilized bones and footprints that paleontologists study today. One of the most striking aspects of the giant reptiles of Pangea was their sheer size. Many species reached lengths of 6, 8, or even 10 meters, with some reports suggesting that certain rare individuals might have approached 15 meters in extreme cases. Their bodies were built for power and endurance, with strong limbs to carry their weight and tails that served both as balance and as formidable weapons. The largest herbivorous reptiles could strip entire trees of foliage, while the carnivorous giants could crush bone and tear through the thick hides of other reptiles. This scale of life created ecosystems unlike any we see today, where humans would have been tiny and vulnerable in comparison. These giants were living embodiments of the raw, untamed energy of a world still being shaped by forces of nature far greater than any individual creature. Despite their dominance in certain regions, giant reptiles were far from invincible. They faced challenges from other predators, disease, competition for food, and the relentless pressure of environmental change. When climates shifted, temperatures rose or fell, or deserts expanded, reptiles that had once thrived could quickly find themselves struggling. In some cases, entire species disappeared from one region while surviving in another, creating patchy distributions that reflected both their adaptability and their limitations. These patterns of disappearance and survival were crucial in shaping the course of evolution, as the extinction of some species allowed others to rise, creating a dynamic and ever-changing landscape of life. The disappearance of giant reptiles from certain regions was often linked to environmental stresses that they could not overcome. Prolonged droughts, increased salinity in water sources, and the encroachment of deserts could devastate populations. In some cases, volcanic activity released toxic gases and ash, suffocating plants and animals alike, and creating inhospitable conditions that persisted for decades or even centuries. These events could wipe out entire populations in a relatively short time, leaving once thriving regions empty and barren. Fossil evidence from these times shows sudden declines in reptile diversity, with the remains of bones scattered across what were once lush habitats. These extinction events were a stark reminder of the vulnerability of even the most formidable creatures when faced with forces beyond their control. Yet, where conditions were favourable, giant reptiles continued to thrive. Forested regions, river deltas, and coastal plains often became strongholds for species that had disappeared elsewhere. Here, water was plentiful, vegetation grew thick, and the climate remained relatively stable. Reptiles in these refuges could grow to their full potential, reproduce in large numbers, and maintain complex social structures. They hunted, foraged, and interacted with countless other species, from smaller reptiles and amphibians to early mammals and insects. These areas became centres of biodiversity, where the richness of life was unparalleled and where giant reptiles could maintain their dominance for millions of years. Migration also played a crucial role in the survival of giant reptiles. As regions became inhospitable, reptiles would move to more favourable areas, sometimes covering vast distances in search of food, water and shelter. This movement allowed species to escape localised disasters and find new opportunities for growth and reproduction. However, migration was fraught with danger. Predators, natural barriers such as mountains or deserts, and competition with other species could all pose serious threats. Only the strongest, most adaptable individuals could successfully relocate and establish themselves in new territories, and even then, survival was never guaranteed. The evolutionary adaptations of giant reptiles were remarkable. Over millions of years, they developed specialized features that allowed them to cope with the extreme conditions of Pangea. Thick, scaly hides protected them from the sun and from predators, while powerful jaws and sharp teeth allowed them to exploit a wide range of food sources. Long tails provided balance and could be used as weapons, while strong limbs enabled them to traverse diverse terrains, from marshes to deserts. Some species developed crests, frills, or other body structures that may have been used for display, mating, or thermoregulation. These adaptations were not uniform across all species. Rather, they reflected the diversity of environments and the specific challenges each population faced. Despite these successes, the ultimate fate of many giant reptiles was extinction. As the late Permian period approached, roughly 250 million years ago, Pangea underwent dramatic climatic and geological changes that would alter the course of life forever. Vast volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere, creating toxic skies and warming the planet. Oceans became stagnant and oxygen deprived, making survival for marine and coastal reptiles extremely difficult. Deserts expanded, rivers dried, and forests receded, leaving once thriving habitats barren. These combined stresses triggered a wave of extinctions, wiping out many of the largest and most dominant reptile species. Fossil evidence shows that some species disappeared completely, leaving no descendants, while others survived only in isolated refuges, their populations greatly reduced and fragmented. The story of the rise and fall of giant reptiles during Pangea is a testament to the power of adaptation and the limits of survival. Their emergence showcased the ability of life to conquer new environments, to grow to astonishing sizes, and to develop intricate adaptations that allowed them to thrive in diverse conditions. Their disappearance, on the other hand, highlights the vulnerability of life to environmental change and catastrophic events, reminding us that even the mightiest creatures are not immune to the forces of nature. Throughout millions of years, these reptiles shaped ecosystems, influenced evolutionary paths, and left a legacy recorded in stone, a legacy that continues to fascinate scientists and enthusiasts alike. Even after the decline of the giant reptiles, their influence persisted. They set the stage for future groups of animals, including dinosaurs, that would rise to prominence in the Mesozoic era. The niches they once occupied were gradually filled by new species that inherited the ecological opportunities left behind. In this way, the story of giant reptiles is not only a tale of triumph and loss, but also a story of continuity, illustrating the interconnectedness of life, evolution, and the ever-changing Earth. Their rise and fall during Pangea remains one of the most vivid chapters in the history of our planet, offering insight into the resilience of life, the power of environmental forces, and the intricate dance between survival and extinction that has shaped the world we know today. The fossil record, with its bones, footprints, and imprints, allows us to trace these magnificent creatures across time and space. In the early regions of Pangea, fossilized remains show a variety of forms, some with long, flexible necks, others with armored bodies, and yet others with immense skulls filled with razor-sharp teeth. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing how these reptiles lived, hunted, and interacted with their surroundings. Paleontologists studying these remains have uncovered patterns of growth, adaptation, and decline that mirror the environmental changes of the time, offering a glimpse into a world both alien and familiar. where life strove to survive in the face of constant challenge. Throughout their existence, giant reptiles demonstrated an incredible capacity for both strength and adaptability. They exploited ecological niches that no other creatures could, from soaring riverbanks to deep forests and arid plains. Their lives were dictated not only by the availability of food and water, but also by the pressures of competition, predation, and climatic fluctuations. Those that succeeded became icons of their time, symbols of the raw power of nature, while those that failed remind us of the fragility inherent in all living systems. Their story is etched into the rock layers of Pangea, a chronicle of rise, dominance, struggle, and eventual decline that continues to capture the imagination of anyone who studies the distant past. Even the smallest details of their anatomy reveal remarkable strategies for survival. The structure of their limbs allowed for bursts of speed or slow, deliberate stalking depending on the species. Their teeth and jaws evolved in response to the types of prey available, with some species developing crushing molars and others serrated edges for tearing flesh. Skin patterns, bone structures, and even traces of soft tissue in exceptional fossils provide clues about how these reptiles regulated their body temperature, communicated with one another, and defended themselves against rivals. Every fossilized fragment tells a story of adaptation, innovation, and the relentless drive to survive in a world that was constantly changing. As the supercontinent continued to experience shifting climates, volcanic activity, and changing sea levels, the balance of life changed dramatically. Giant reptiles that once ruled certain areas were pushed to the brink of extinction, while others adapted and migrated to new regions. These cycles of opportunity and catastrophe defined their existence, illustrating the delicate interplay between life and environment. The survivors of these tumultuous periods laid the groundwork for future evolutionary leaps, influencing the trajectory of life on Earth for millions of years to come. The rise and fall of giant reptiles in Pangea is more than a tale of size and power. It is a story of adaptation, environmental challenge, and the resilience of life itself. Their journey from modest beginnings to dominance, followed by decline and extinction in some areas, underscores the complex and dynamic nature of ecosystems. It highlights how species respond to opportunities and threats, how environmental change can reshape life, and how even the mightiest creatures are ultimately subject to the forces of Earth's ever-changing landscapes. Through the fossil record, through painstaking study, and through imagination grounded in science, we can witness a world where giant reptiles once roamed, ruled, and struggled, leaving an enduring imprint on the history of life. The giant reptiles of Pangea, in all their diversity, power, and vulnerability, are enduring symbols of a world that existed hundreds of millions of years before humans walked the Earth. Their rise in some regions and disappearance in others demonstrate the intricate balance between adaptation and extinction, a balance that continues to shape the living world today. The story of these reptiles is a reminder that life, in all its forms, is both resilient and fragile, capable of incredible feats, yet always subject to the whims of a changing planet. Their legacy, captured in fossils and in the very fabric of Pangea's history, continues to inspire wonder, curiosity, and a deep appreciation for the forces that have shaped life on Earth. The rise and fall of giant reptiles is thus a narrative of extremes, survival, and the relentless passage of time. From the lush river valleys where they thrived to the deserts and volcanic landscapes where they struggled and disappeared, these creatures embodied the triumphs and tragedies of life in a supercontinent shaped by fire, water, wind, and rock. Their story is written not just in bones, but in the patterns of extinction and survival, in the echoes of evolution, and in the rich tapestry of life that continues to unfold on Earth long after their reign has ended. This elaborate chronicle of early reptiles, their growth, dominance, and partial disappearance across Pangea allows us to appreciate not only the power of life, but also the delicate interplay of environmental forces, adaptation, and chance. It is a story that continues to evolve as new fossils are discovered, new analyses are conducted, and our understanding of Pangea's vast, complex landscapes grows deeper. In every bone, every footprint, and every layer of rock, the legacy of these giant reptiles endures, telling a story of survival, struggle, and transformation that resonates across hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history. Their story is far from static. Each discovery adds new dimensions to our understanding, revealing the myriad ways in which these reptiles interacted with their environment and with one another. Fossils indicate social behaviours, hunting strategies, and even possible care for offspring in some species. They illustrate a world in which life was constantly negotiating the challenges of space, food, climate, and competition, a world in which giant reptiles were both rulers and victims of circumstance. Their presence shaped ecosystems, influenced the evolution of other species, and left an indelible mark on the geological record. Ultimately, the giant reptiles of Pangea represent a remarkable chapter in the history of life, one that demonstrates the extraordinary adaptability and vulnerability of living creatures. Their rise in favourable regions, their survival through extreme conditions, and their disappearance in other areas all highlight the delicate balance that governs life on Earth. These creatures, in all their grandeur and diversity, offer profound insights into evolution, ecology, and the interplay between organisms and the environments they inhabit. They remind us that life is a story of constant change, a tapestry woven from the threads of survival, adaptation, and extinction, and that even the mightiest of beings are ultimately shaped by the world around them. The rise and fall of these giant reptiles, chronicled across hundreds of millions of years of geological and fossil records, remains one of the most captivating stories of prehistory. It reflects the intricate dance between life and environment, the successes and failures of adaptation, and the powerful forces that can elevate or destroy entire species. As scientists continue to explore the remnants of Pangea and uncover new fossils, the narrative of these extraordinary reptiles grows richer, offering ever more vivid insights into a world that once was, a world of giants, extremes, and enduring mysteries that continue to inspire awe and fascination. The legacy of giant reptiles in Pangea also provides a lens through which we can understand broader patterns of life on Earth. Their successes and failures foreshadowed the rise of other dominant species, including the dinosaurs, and illustrated the ways in which environmental pressures, competition, and chance events shaped the course of evolution. By studying the conditions that allowed some species to thrive while others vanished, scientists can gain insights into the resilience of life, the impact of climate and habitat changes, and the interconnectedness of ecosystems. Each fossil, each geological layer, tells a story not only of the creatures themselves, but also of the broader forces at work on the supercontinent of Pangea. Giant reptiles in their rise and fall teach us about the balance between power and vulnerability, dominance and extinction, and the ever-present influence of the environment on life. Their existence reminds us that adaptation is crucial, that no species is guaranteed survival, and that the story of life is always a story of change. Across the vast stretches of Pangea, from lush coasts to arid interiors, from rivers to volcanic plains, these creatures left a mark that endures in the fossil record and in our understanding of Earth's deep past. They were, for a time, the giants of their world, rulers of landscapes both beautiful and brutal, and their story continues to resonate across the ages. The age of Pangea was a world very different from the one we know today. It was a time when all the continents were fused into a single massive landmass, stretching across much of the Earth and creating conditions unlike any that exist now. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide, oxygen levels were much higher than they are today, and the climate was harsh and extreme, with scorching heat in the interior lands and enormous seasonal swings that could make winters bitterly cold. It was a world that would have seemed hostile and unforgiving to most living creatures, yet for insects, it became a time of extraordinary opportunity. Insects, the small creatures we often overlook today, suddenly found themselves thriving in ways that were unimaginable, growing to enormous sizes and spreading across the vast lands of Pangea in huge numbers. The story of insects during this period is a story of adaptation, survival, and evolution on a scale that seems almost fantastical. One of the main reasons insects flourished during the time of Pangea was the composition of the atmosphere. Around 300 million years ago, the levels of oxygen in the air were significantly higher than they are in modern times, reaching nearly 35% compared to the 21% we have today. This abundance of oxygen had a direct effect on the bodies of insects. Unlike mammals and birds, insects rely on a network of tiny tubes called tracheae, to carry oxygen directly to their tissues. The higher the oxygen in the air, the more efficiently it could move through these tubes, allowing insects to grow larger than they could in a lower oxygen environment. Some species of dragonflies, for example, grew to have wingspans of more than 75 centimeters, almost 3 feet from tip to tip, making them the largest flying insects the world has ever known. Similarly, cockroaches could reach lengths of more than 30 centimeters, and millipedes could stretch to over 2 meters, creeping slowly across the forest floors. These were creatures so large and powerful that they would dwarf most modern insects, yet they lived in a world where such growth was possible because of the extraordinary oxygen-rich atmosphere. Another factor that allowed insects to dominate during this time was the sheer abundance of plants and decaying organic matter. The interior regions of Pangea were home to immense forests and swampy wetlands, filled with ferns, giant horsetails, seed ferns, and towering coniferous trees. These plants provided both food and shelter for insects, creating a complex web of ecological niches that insects could exploit. Herbivorous insects fed on the leaves, stems, and roots of these plants, while scavengers and decomposers thrived on the constant supply of decaying material that littered the forest floors. Insects like giant cockroaches could graze on fallen leaves, while early beetles burrowed into rotting wood, consuming it and breaking it down into nutrients for other life forms. The combination of plentiful food and suitable shelter allowed insect populations to grow at an unprecedented rate, and this in turn created more opportunities for predators, including other insects, to thrive as well. This period saw the emergence of complex food webs in which insects were both the dominant herbivores and the primary prey for larger arthropods, amphibians, and early reptiles. The climate of Pangea, despite its dangers, also played a crucial role in the rise of insects. While the supercontinent experienced extreme heat, massive deserts, and severe seasonal changes, insects were exceptionally well suited to cope with these conditions. Their small size, segmented bodies, and exoskeletons provided protection against dehydration, heat, and sudden changes in temperature. Many insects developed behaviors and adaptations that allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions, such as burrowing into the soil to escape the midday sun, or taking refuge under leaf litter and rotting logs. Seasonal changes prompted bursts of reproduction, with some species laying hundreds or even thousands of eggs at a time, ensuring that at least some offspring would survive the extremes of the Pangean climate. The resilience and versatility of insects allowed them to colonize every corner of the supercontinent, from humid swamps to arid deserts, and even the edges of massive inland seas that stretched across Pangea's interior. In addition to environmental factors, evolutionary innovations also helped insects thrive during this era. Wings, for example, gave insects the ability to escape predators, explore new habitats, and reach food sources that would otherwise be inaccessible. Early flying insects, such as dragonflies and mayflies, used their wings not only to hunt but also to disperse across vast distances, linking populations that were otherwise separated by deserts, mountains, and other natural barriers. Other adaptations, such as the development of hardened exoskeletons, allowed insects to retain moisture and protect themselves from the increasingly harsh climate. Many species also developed specialized mouthparts and digestive systems, enabling them to exploit new food sources, from tough plant material to decaying flesh. These evolutionary innovations, combined with favorable environmental conditions, created a perfect storm in which insects could grow larger, reproduce faster, and colonize new areas with remarkable efficiency. Predation and competition also played a role in shaping the diversity and size of Pangea's insects. In a world where insects were dominant, competition for resources was fierce. Herbivorous insects had to contend not only with one another for leaves, stems, and roots, but also with early amphibians and reptiles that fed on them. Predatory insects such as giant dragonflies and prehistoric mantises developed hunting strategies that allowed them to capture even the fastest prey, using their size, speed, and specialized limbs to dominate the food chain. The pressures of competition and predation created an evolutionary arms race, in which insects had to adapt rapidly or risk extinction. This constant push and pull between predators and prey drove the development of new traits, from stronger wings and faster flight to sharper mandibles and more efficient digestive systems, further enhancing the ability of insects to flourish in the Pangean world. fossil evidence provides a striking window into the world of these giant insects. Fossils from coal-rich deposits in regions that were once swampy forests of Pangea reveal not only the size of these creatures but also their diversity. Dragonflies with wingspans approaching 3 feet, millipedes longer than 2 meters, and cockroaches the size of modern cats all point to a world in which insects were truly the rulers of the land. These fossils also show intricate details of wing structure, leg anatomy and mouth parts, giving scientists insights into how these insects moved, fed, and interacted with their environment. In some cases, fossilized tracks and burrows indicate that insects were not just passive inhabitants of the landscape, but active engineers, reshaping the soil, vegetation, and even local ecosystems with their activities. The sheer scale of these fossils is a testament to the extraordinary conditions of Pangea and the unique adaptations that allowed insects to reach sizes that would be impossible in today's world. Interestingly, the flourishing of insects during Pangea was not only a story of growth, but also of resilience in the face of global crises. The supercontinent experienced frequent volcanic eruptions, shifting climates, and episodes of mass extinction that wiped out many other forms of life. Yet insects were remarkably resilient, surviving events that decimated amphibians, early reptiles, and many plants. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and adaptability allowed them to endure changes that would have been catastrophic for larger animals. In some ways, the success of insects during this period laid the foundation for their continued dominance in the millions of years that followed. Even as Pangea began to break apart and climates changed, insects were able to diversify, colonize new continents, and continue evolving into the vast array of species we see today. The rise of insects during the Pangean age also had profound effects on the ecosystems around them. As insects grew larger and more numerous, they became a major influence on plant life, soil composition, and the food web. Herbivorous insects affected the growth and spread of plants by feeding on leaves, stems, and roots, while decomposers helped recycle nutrients back into the soil, supporting new generations of vegetation. Predatory insects controlled populations of other arthropods and smaller animals, maintaining a balance within the ecosystem. In this way, insects were not merely inhabitants of the world, they were key players in shaping it. The vast swarms of insects, the towering dragonflies, and the immense millipedes were forces of nature, contributing to the dynamics of Pangea in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend today. It is also fascinating to consider the social and behavioral aspects of these giant insects. While direct evidence is limited, some fossil findings suggest that certain species may have exhibited behaviors similar to those of modern social insects such as ants, bees, and termites. And colonies or groups of insects could have coordinated activities, defended territories, and exploited food sources in complex ways. Even solitary species may have displayed advanced hunting strategies, migration patterns, or reproductive behaviors that allowed them to survive in a world filled with predators and environmental challenges. The combination of physical adaptations, ecological roles, and potential behavioral complexity paints a picture of a vibrant, bustling world in which insects were among the most successful and fascinating creatures on the planet. In conclusion, the story of insects during the age of Pangea is one of extraordinary growth, adaptation, and ecological dominance. The unique combination of a high oxygen atmosphere, abundant food sources, extreme climate conditions, evolutionary innovations, and ecological interactions created an environment in which insects could grow to incredible sizes and spread across the vast supercontinent in huge numbers. Fossil evidence provides a glimpse of this ancient world, revealing creatures that were larger, more diverse, and more resilient than anything we see today. Insects were not just survivors, they were rulers, engineers, and shapers of the Pangean landscape, thriving in ways that would be impossible under modern conditions. Their success during this deadly and extreme age of Earth's history is a testament to the power of adaptation, the opportunities provided by unique environmental conditions, and the enduring resilience of life in even the harshest circumstances. The age of giant insects is a reminder of how radically different life on Earth could be, and how small creatures, given the right conditions, can dominate the planet in spectacular fashion. This period, spanning millions of years, ultimately set the stage for the continued evolution and diversification of insects, ensuring that even after the fall of Pangea and the rise of new continents and climates, insects would remain one of the most successful and enduring groups of animals on Earth. Their dominance during this time is a story of survival, growth, and adaptation that continues to inspire scientists and enthusiasts alike, offering a window into a world where the tiniest creatures held unimaginable power and shaped the very fabric of life on the planet. Life on Earth during the time of Pangea existed in a delicate balance, a fragile web where every creature, every plant, every tiny microorganism, and every drop of water played a part in keeping the natural world alive. But this web was not as strong as it might seem. Around 300 million years ago, during the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, the Earth faced one of the most dangerous periods in its long history. Gigantic volcanic eruptions, extreme climate changes, and shifts in the atmosphere caused ecosystems to crumble. Forests that once stretched endlessly across the land began to shrivel and disappear. Oceans, once teeming with fish and other marine life, became oxygen-starved and stagnant. Insects which had grown to enormous sizes scrambled to survive in habitats that were shrinking and becoming more hostile. Even the largest reptiles and early mammals struggled to find enough food and water in the harsh conditions. The balance that had taken millions of years to build began to collapse, and life itself seemed to hang by a thread. The collapse of ecosystems did not happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping disaster, a chain reaction that affected every layer of life. In forests, towering trees that had taken decades or even centuries to grow suddenly found their roots in soil that was drying up or poisoned by volcanic ash. Leaves withered and fell, and without them, the small animals that lived among the branches had no shelter or food. Insects that fed on those plants either starved or were forced to migrate to new regions. As the insects moved, predators that depended on them, like early amphibians and reptiles, began to suffer. Rivers that once provided fresh water for fish and amphibians became clogged with sediment from eroded mountains, and many fish species could not survive the changing conditions. Every collapse in one part of the web sent tremors throughout the rest. The oceans were no less dramatic in their decline. Seas that had once been vibrant with life turned into vast dark stretches where oxygen barely existed. Coral-like organisms, shellfish, and the smaller plankton species that formed the base of the oceanic food chain struggled to survive. Without plankton, larger animals like early sharks and marine reptiles found their food supply vanishing. Some species managed to adapt, finding refuge in shallow areas near the coast, or in regions where currents brought some oxygen and nutrients, but these were few and far between. Many species vanished entirely, leaving empty spaces in ecosystems that had once been crowded with life. These gaps did not remain empty forever, but the recovery was slow and uneven. On land, the challenges were equally severe. The supercontinent of Pangea created enormous deserts at its heart, where temperatures soared during the day and plunged at night. These harsh conditions made survival difficult for both plants and animals. Forests that had survived centuries of changing climate now found themselves in the path of deadly droughts. Animals that had evolved to live in lush forests were suddenly exposed to barren landscapes where food was scarce. Early reptiles and synapsids, which had thrived for millions of years, now faced starvation, disease, and competition for the limited resources that remained. The balance between predator and prey, herbivore and plant, was thrown into chaos. Recovery of ecosystems was not simple or immediate. Life returned in fits and starts, often taking thousands or even millions of years to re-establish itself. Pioneer species, usually small and hardy plants and insects, were the first to colonize damaged landscapes. They stabilized soils, helped retain moisture, and created the first shelters and food sources for other animals. Over time, these initial colonizers allowed more complex plants and animals to return. Forests grew again, though they were often different from those that had existed before. Early trees that had once dominated the land were replaced by new species that could tolerate drier conditions. Predators returned, but their numbers were smaller, and their diets had to adapt to the new arrangement of life. The web of life slowly began to reconnect, though it was never exactly the same as it had been before the collapse. The fragility of life during this period highlights how interconnected all species truly are. When one element fails, the effects ripple across the ecosystem. A single event like a massive volcanic eruption or a prolonged drought could cause a cascade of extinctions. Yet, despite the destruction, life demonstrated an incredible resilience. Even in the harshest deserts, in the oxygen-poor seas, in areas buried under layers of volcanic ash, organisms found ways to survive and adapt. Over time, these survivors laid the groundwork for the next wave of ecosystems. Each recovery was fragile at first, easily disrupted by further environmental changes, but gradually more complexity returned to the world. It is also important to understand that the collapse of ecosystems was not uniform. Some areas fared better than others. Regions closer to the coasts often had more stable climates and access to water, allowing life to persist more easily. Mountainous areas could trap moisture and create microhabitats where plants and animals survived when surrounding plains became deserts. Islands, lakes, and river valleys acted as refuges where species could weather the worst of the climate and later spread back into damaged areas. The uneven nature of collapse and recovery meant that life was continually in motion, searching for habitable environments and adapting to what the Earth offered. The story of this fragile web of life is also a story of competition and innovation. As ecosystems collapsed, surviving species were forced to adapt in new ways. Some developed tougher skins or scales to withstand heat and dryness. Others evolved to digest new types of plants or prey that had survived in the changing environment. Certain insects grew even larger, using their size to protect themselves or to take advantage of new food sources. Predators evolved sharper teeth or faster speeds to catch the scarce prey that remained. In these struggles, life experimented with countless strategies, some successful, some doomed to fail. Ultimately, the collapse and slow recovery of ecosystems during Pangea's deadly age show the delicate balance of life on Earth. Each species, no matter how small, played a vital role in the survival of the whole. The environmental stresses of this period pushed life to its limits, causing widespread extinctions and forcing evolution to act rapidly. Yet, the story is also one of hope. Even after devastation, life persisted, adapted, and found ways to rebuild, layer by layer, creating the rich diversity that would eventually populate the Earth millions of years later. This delicate, fragile web continues to be a lesson. Life is resilient, but it is also vulnerable, and the survival of ecosystems depends on the careful interplay of countless forces across the planet. The cycle of collapse and recovery repeated many times over the course of millions of years, each time reshaping the Earth's landscapes and the creatures that inhabited them. In the deserts, forests, and oceans of Pangea, life struggled, fell, and rose again, leaving behind a planet forever changed by the fragile dance between destruction and renewal. In this story, we see not only the vulnerability of life, but also its extraordinary determination to endure, adapt, and thrive despite the harshest challenges nature could impose. Life on Earth, even in its most fragile moments, never gave up entirely, and each recovery added a new chapter to the ever-unfolding story of evolution. This web of life, delicate yet resilient, was both a testament to the power of adaptation and a warning about the consequences of environmental collapse. It is a story written not in a single year or century, but across millions of years, a story of extinction and rebirth, of struggle and survival, showing that even when life seems most fragile, it still finds a way to endure and rebuild. The echoes of these collapses are still visible in the fossil record today, in the layers of sediment, the remains of plants and animals, and the reshaped landscapes of continents that have drifted and changed over hundreds of millions of years. Each fossil, each ancient soil layer, tells a part of the story of how life can fall apart and slowly come back together, revealing the intricate, fragile, and endlessly fascinating web of life that has persisted on Earth through every trial and disaster.